Are we here? Can you guys see me? Okay, a couple of you are already here. Sharon, good to see you. I think we might see Stephanie a little bit later. Amy, Paddy, Robbie, Robin, hey Jealousy. Good to see you guys here. Have I missed anyone? Sharon's been here for quite a while, quite early on. So, sorry, I'm still just kind of reeling a little bit. Spirit of 1776, good to see you. So, in this live stream, we're going to talk about the Borinage, which is in Belgium. I've got two books here that I'm going to refer to. Timmy, I'm going to refer to these two books, okay? And I'm also going to, again, jump forward in time, dealing with a letter sort of at the end, or maybe not the end, but in the future of the Borinage period. And the reason I want to do that is so that you can see where all of this is headed. Now, if you guys aren't sure, or if you don't know, this is quite a dark period for Van Gogh. He's been wanting to go out into the world. He's been wanting to be hardcore. He's been wanting to put his money where his mouth is. He's been wanting this experience of deprivation and poverty and suffering and misery. Well, now he's about to get it, right? So where we are now, it is around about mid-1878. And just to give you kind of a ballpark, in the following year, in 1879, there'll only be 4 letters. So you know how many letters we've been going through year after year. It's taken us 11 episodes to get to this point, right? Well, I guess including this one, 10 episodes. Well, there are only 4 letters in 1879 when he's in the Borinage, and then the following year, just 6 letters, right? So the letter writing, the communication drops kind of precipitously. And in a weird way, Van Gogh's journey takes kind of an ominous turn. If he was a certain person before this, he kind of emerges on the other side, kind of, I don't know, even more intense, even more isolated, even more sort of eccentric in a way. But it feels like when he goes to the Borinage, he actually cuts the final ties that hold him to society. And so when he emerges on the other side, he's sort of fully disentangled himself from society, where he kind of gives society the middle finger, right? And I think all sort of true artists in a way do that. I think all true artists sort of can stand apart, can stand on their own, can stand independently, and can also look at society. I think it's a mixture of contempt for society, but also the feeling that society has had contempt for them. I think it's sort of a transaction. But nevertheless, he comes out of this whole period separate from society. Timmy, what are you doing? No, I'm not sick. I'm not feeling that great. I did exercise earlier today, which may be the reason my voice is a bit funny. I ran and I cycled. So that could be, if I sound a bit funny, maybe that's the reason. It is very cold here. We're having kind of sub-zero temperatures at this point, so I presume it's quite warm where you guys are. Yeah, Sharon says, well, only 4 letters. Yeah, not a lot. So I'm not going to go far beyond, I'm not going to go beyond the Borinage, so we're not going to deal with a terrible amount of letters here. I don't want to go too far over the hour mark in terms of this live. Just feeling a little bit drained and stuff. But yeah, Amy says your voice is different. Yeah, I'm not sure if the cold's got something to do with it. It may also have something to do with, training a little bit earlier today. So it could be something to do with that. Amy says, I'm jealous of the cold. It's hot here, 93 degrees. Do you want to swap? I'll be happy to swap. Okay, so Timmy, can I put you down? Because I need to refer to this book. So I'm going to start off by going through this book. Remember, I've mentioned this book in the previous episode. I spoke about my brother temporarily loaning me the book. Timmy, just give me a moment. And so I'm going to be quoting from this book, which deals with the making of the artist, page 14 of this book, right? And there's just really 2 paragraphs dealing with the Borinage, which is kind of quite weird. Patty says, we appreciate any time that you can give us. Okay, swap homes. Okay, cool. Thanks, Say Jealousy. Okay, so this is quoting from this book, and it reads as follows. In the Borinage, his self-sacrificing spirit, meaning Vincent van Gogh's self-sacrificing spirit, and I think it's quite important just to bear in mind that that's the kind of identity he has. He's self-sacrificing, right? Think about that with regard to the future, the ear incident, the supposed suicide incident, and the whole thing about not having money and being poor. That's what he wants. And so this is like Vincent van Gogh's wet dream. If he wants to be a self-sacrificing dude, he's about to have his dreams come completely true. So it says here, in the Borinage, which is a coal mining area in Belgium, I'll take you through that in a moment, Vincent van Gogh's self-sacrificing spirit had a field day. The Evangelical Committee, that's the sort of group of religious folk who were sort of in charge of Vincent's religious sort of mustering. They said, okay, you can preach to this congregation. So the Evangelical Committee opted not to renew Vincent's contract, claiming that he had rather overdone his zeal. So the sort of group of pastors kind of said, okay, that's enough. Timmy, you're going to throw down that picture. Just give me a second to read this. Just calm down, Timmy. Okay, so they opted not to renew Vincent's contract, and they said that he'd overdone his zeal. He had even given his clothing. Vincent had even given his clothing to the needy, like St. Martin, had lived in a tumble-down hut like St. Francis, I guess that's St. Francis of Assisi, and had existed on a diet of bread and water, as demanded by the strictest of spiritual exercises. And you might remember in some of his earlier letters to Theo, he was saying, Theo, take my advice, eat bread. Theo, listen to what I'm saying, you must eat bread. And that is Van Gogh taking literally the admonition in the Bible to give us this our daily bread. So he's like, okay, so I should eat bread, right? It goes on here to say, in the Borinage, Vincent touched rock bottom, and he found that the life of a preacher really suited him no better than that of an art dealer. So what do you think that means? Does that mean that his mission brought him closer to God? So I see 55% of you have said yes, that when he went to the Borinage, he was sort of like happy and fulfilled. Do you think that's true? Right? I see, so most of you said yes. Some of you said no, about a third of you. And about 9% said yes and no. So they say here that the life of a preacher suited him about as much or no more than being an art dealer. So he went to the Borinage, he did his thing, and he was like, I think I'm done with being a preacher. So he's sort of done with being an art dealer, after this he would be done with being a preacher. What do you think he would do after that? Robbie Robbins said, did Vincent end up being malnourished? I wouldn't be surprised. Hey Jealousy says, Vincent gave everything away to the poor. Yeah, it was very hard to give Vincent money because he would just give it away. And that lasted even beyond this period. So you can see he had quite a fanatical, quite a sort of, I don't know what the word is, beyond like very intense, very hardcore approach to being this sort of divine figure, this, something that is quite interesting in the link that I put up for you guys is it talks about the books that he was reading while he lived in Belgium, and they included, for example, Victor Hugo and Charles Dickens. I don't see Emile Zola there, but I know he was also reading that. Anyway, it goes on to say, so in the Borinage, he touched rock bottom. He didn't want to be a preacher anymore. He was living without any income among the poorest of the poor, a standing reproach to the middle classes. Even Theo was daunted. From October 1879 to July 1880, their correspondence was interrupted. So things went so dark, I guess. Things took such a dark turn that Vincent kind of even turned his back on his own brother. I suppose you could also say Theo didn't really want to, or didn't really know what to say to his brother. But basically, even their relationship kind of, fizzled. If you think about, if you imagine like a thread of string holding them together, that thread kind of unraveled. That thread was broken, right? So it also says it wasn't until Vincent finally accepted one of his brother's postal money orders that the silence was broken. So Vincent probably had this attitude of, I don't want money, I shouldn't have money, and as a result of that position, thanks a lot, Hey Jealousy. As a result of that position, even if he wanted to write to his brother, he couldn't because he didn't have any money. So he kind of jumped into like a maelstrom and didn't seem to really want to come out of it. And so it was kind of a very weird situation for his parents who were looking on, his siblings who were looking on, and particularly Theo who was looking on. And if he thought he was doing a great job, while the evangelical committee were like, we need to get this dude out of here. We need this guy gone. So anyway, it says, in his reply to the money order that Theo sent, Vincent van Gogh proved to be a changed man, stripped of illusions, his head cleared, and with a new vocation, art. So when he finally writes back to his brother, it's basically, okay, I'm done with this. I'm on to the next phase of my life. So would you say that his mission to the Borinage brought him closer to God? You would think that if it did, he would have come out of that and continued to preach, but he didn't. He came out of that and was like, screw this, I'm going to paint, right? That was kind of his response. That was the sentiment that he brought once he came out of there. And that is it. That's how much this really deals, how much this book deals with that short, I mean, it's just a very short, what's the word? It's a very short description of what is actually quite a profound, powerful, important period of his life. Then I've also got this book, and it takes us kind of into the future. It's an extract from, I don't know how you say it, is it Kisme or is it Kismis? Kuzma. I don't know if Bria was here, she'd be able to tell us. But it's basically a letter he writes in July 1880. And obviously it's quite a significant letter. So I'm going to read that to you, and then we're going to go back in time. I'm also going to tell you a little bit about the Borinage, quite an interesting area. The Borinage today is nothing like the Borinage in that time. The Borinage was also a period that saw unrest, and you can kind of compare it in a way to the Donbas area in Ukraine. The Donbas area is well known for coal mining and steel production. Well, and it's kind of being contested right now. Well, the Borinage is very important, a very important source for Europe's energy. And so you had masses of people working there like ants, and often in not very good conditions. And if they protested, the dissent was crushed. So anyway, let's just read from this letter. It's from Vincent van Gogh to his brother, written from Kuzma, July 1880. So about 2 years into the future from where we actually left off. We are going to go back to that. So are you guys ready? Fasten your seatbelts for this. Paddy says he did find his true calling. Okay. So this is what he writes to Theo. I'm writing to you rather reluctantly because for a good many reasons I've kept silent for such a long time. To some extent, you have become a stranger to me. He's saying that to Theo. You've become a stranger to me, and I to you perhaps more than you think. It is probably better for us not to go on like that. It is probable that I would not have written to you even now, were it not that I feel obliged, compelled to do so, because, be it noted, you yourself have compelled me to. I heard in Eton that you had sent 50 francs for me. Well, I have accepted them, with reluctance, of course, with a feeling of some despondency, of course. But I have reached a sort of impasse, am in trouble, what else can I do? And so I'm writing to thank you. So his brother sends him 50 francs, and this kind of leads to a crisis where he's like, I don't want this money. I'm not going to take this money. I'm not going to accept this money, but then he does. And then he realizes, what's wrong with me, kind of thing. Timmy, just give me a second to read this, okay? Then he says, as you may know, I'm back in the Borinage. Father said he would prefer me to stay somewhere near Eton, but I refused, and I believe I was right to do so. To the family I have, more or less, become a more or less objectionable and shady sort of character, at any rate, a bad lot. So he's kind of saying that he's fallen from grace in the eyes of his family. He's saying that his family are now regarding him as a shady fellow, as almost like a crook. Then he says, now though, but bear in mind, in a weird way, he's now once again let down his family. He was sort of trained to be this sort of art dealer. Then he left that in a bit of disgrace. Now he's been trying to be a preacher, and now there's a bit of disgrace surrounding that as well. And so they're like, what is going on with you? Like, what is your deal, dude? Kind of thing. So he says, now, though, it is a fairly hopeless task to regain the trust of an entire family, one which has perhaps never been wholly weaned from prejudice and other equally honorable and respectable qualities. I'm not entirely without hope that bit by bit, slowly but surely, the good relationship between one and all may be restored. And although that's kind of quite a nice sentiment and it's quite positive, any, honor and respect that he regains, he squanders in terms of his weird attraction to certain members of the opposite sex, right? So if he does regain some honor from his family, he will only throw it away again with regard to other sort of dalliances he gets involved in, and you kind of get quite a strong feeling that he doesn't really care what other people think about him. He's sort of reached a point where he's moved beyond the fact that people are disappointed in him, and now he's like, I really don't care. I don't really care what you think. I did care, but I'm so far gone. I've fallen so far. I guess that just goes with the territory. He goes on to say, in the first place, I should be glad to see this good relationship, to put it no more strongly than that, restored at least between father and me. So he's saying, kind of my priority is I'd like my relationship with dad to be fixed, right? And then he says, and further, I set great store by seeing it restored between the two of us, meaning between Vincent and Theo. A good relationship is infinitely preferable to a misunderstanding. Then he says, now I must trouble you with certain abstract matters, hoping that you will listen to them patiently. I am a man of passions, capable of and given to doing more or less outrageous things for which I sometimes feel a little sorry. It's quite a big statement there. Let me read that again. I'm a man of passions, meaning I'm kind of an intense guy, I'm quite an emotional guy. I'm capable of and given to doing more or less outrageous things for which I sometimes feel a little bit sorry. So he's saying, I admit maybe I kind of overdid things. Then he says, every so often I say or do something too hastily when it would have been better to have shown a little more patience. Other people also act rashly at times, I think. So what you have here is Vincent, who's still a 20-something, I think he's maybe 27 years old, who's kind of admitting, maybe I made a mistake. He's admitting, maybe I acted a bit rashly. Maybe I was a bit too emotional. Maybe I was a bit naive. Maybe I was a bit idealistic. And he's actually trying to now regain his relationship in a way with his estranged family. He's kind of rescinded some of those relationships. Now he's kind of saying, sorry, can we do this again? Can you forgive me, right? Then he says, should I consider myself a dangerous person, unfit for anything? I think not. Rather, every means should be tried to put these very passions to good effect. So he's kind of saying, what must I do with these feelings? What must I do with these passions? And I think what he does end, sorry, what he does end up doing I think in the sense of his personality probably was the right thing for him, meaning if he is this guy with so much energy, so much mental energy, so much creative energy, so much intensity, isn't the best place to sort of, I don't know, for all of that to come out in these sort of endless splatters of art, these endless thick layers of yellow and whatnot, for his energy to be transferred onto a canvas endlessly, more and more canvases. Isn't that like the best solution to the problem that he has, which is his restless energy? And I think the answer is yes, that was a good solution. Then he says, to mention just one by way of example, I have a more or less irresistible passion for books and the constant need to improve my mind, to study, if you like, just as I have a need to eat bread. You will understand that. So he's talking here about that he can't stop reading, he's become this devourer of knowledge. And of course, the more that he reads these books, the more it sort of inflames the sense of being inspired and the sense of wanting to go on fairly eccentric adventures, right? Pilgrimages. Then he goes on to say, when I lived in other surroundings full of pictures and works of art, I conceived a violent, almost fanatical passion for those surroundings, as you know, and I do not regret that. And even now, far from home, I often feel homesick for the land of pictures. And that is emphasized in his letter, that is italicized. What he's realized while he's been in the bleakness of these coal mines is that he misses what he describes as the land of pictures. He misses art, right? He says, I feel homesick for the land of pictures. You may remember that I knew very well, and it may be that I know it still, what Rembrandt was, or what Millet was, or Jules Dupré, or Delacroix, or Millet, or Matthijs Maris. Well, today I'm no longer in those surroundings, yet they say that what is known as the soul never dies, but lives on forever, continuing to seek forever and ever again. So again, this is an allusion to him saying, I still feel the call to art. I still feel this longing for artists and art and the pictures of artists. Then he says, for example, that I've often neglected my appearance. I admit it. And I also admit that it is shocking. But look here, lack of money and poverty have something to do with it too, as well as a profound disillusionment. And besides, it is sometimes a good way of ensuring the solitude you need, of concentrating more or less on whatever study you are immersed in. Now, for the past 5 years or so, I don't know how long exactly, I've been more or less without permanent employment, wandering from pillar to post. You will say, ever since such and such a time, you have been going downhill, you have been feeble, you have done nothing. But is that entirely true? Right? So he basically says, part of why I neglect my appearance is I don't really want to be bothered by other people. I don't want to have to deal with other people. I think he's also reacting to word that has gotten to him and to his family that Vincent doesn't look very good. He kind of looks like a tramp or something. What is going on with this guy, right? He goes on to say, what is true is that I have at times earned my own crust of bread, and at other times a friend has given it to me out of the goodness of his heart. I've lived whatever way I could, for better or worse, taking things just as they came. It is true that I've forfeited the trust of various people. It is true that my financial affairs are in a sorry state. It is true that the future looks rather bleak. So this book describes this letter as a sort of a grudging thank you note. He's sort of saying, sorry, but not sorry. Thank you, but I'm kind of going to carry on the weird way that I've been going. And I know I haven't really achieved much in my life. Things don't look very good. So it's quite weird. It's almost like he's just embracing misery, embracing failure, and is determined to continue embracing it. It's quite strange. It's like someone who says, do you want to succeed in life? And he says, no, I want to fail. But, it's like, how does that make sense? Why do you want to fail? No, I want to be downtrodden. I want to, if I succeed, then I'm going to have money. I want to not have money. Do you want to meet a girl? No. I don't want to look after my appearance. I want to repel people. I want someone to come up to me, not because of anything and give me a piece of bread, and that means something. That's a genuine human encounter kind of thing, right? So there's another letter from Brussels. I don't know if I want to read this one right now. I don't think I'm going to read it just yet, because I think we've got to go backwards in time first. Bridget says, such a busy mind gives rise to those magical swirls and movement, life in the brushstrokes. Yeah. Okay, so I see we're up to 18% saying yes and no. Okay, so before we get going with the next couple of letters, I want to introduce you guys to the Borinage. It's not going to be a long history. It's basically just, and then also this is the house that Vincent lived in when he was there. I must say, for a guy who was apparently stinky and smelly and whatever, this isn't a bad place to stay, if you ask me. I wouldn't mind living in a place like that. Okay, so the Borinage is an area in Belgium. It's quite close to the French border, so it's closer to France than it is to the Netherlands. If you know your geography, if you are traveling from Paris to Amsterdam, then you go through Belgium on the way there. Belgium is between the Netherlands and France, and the Borinage is on the French side of Belgium, so far on the far side from, in terms of the Dutch border. The French inhabitants that live there are called Borains in the Borinage, and it says here there's a great sociological difference between Mons and the Borains. So you can kind of imagine that there was a bit of a culture clash when the people were sort of going to the Borinage to work. You'd have some very, very poor people, and then you would have some local people who were different. Anyway, we now go down to coal, right? So obviously during this time, Van Gogh's time, coal was incredibly important in the history of the world and in industrialization. They were using coal in order for steam trains to do their thing, steam boats to do their thing. Coal basically, was the primary fuel for the world's industrial furnaces, and it had to come from somewhere. So according to this Wikipedia article, it says, from the 18th century to 1850, the economy of 30 municipalities in the Borinage was founded on coal mining, 30 municipalities. Between 1822 and 1829, production more than doubled in that region, from 602,000 to 1.26 million tons. That was more than the total production of France and Germany at the time. That's pretty incredible. The Borinage exported its coal mostly to France and Flanders. So once again, there's a bit of an analogy here to the Donbas area in Ukraine, an area that produces so much that they can kind of export it. They can export their resources to other countries. Flanders is obviously a territory in the Netherlands. Then as late as 1957, so 60 odd years ago, there were still almost 65,000 people working in the Borinage. Of that, about half or maybe a third, 23,000 still working in the coal industry. So you can imagine at its height, it was a pretty busy area, teeming with people that were sort of ant-like, instead of using trucks and mechanical equipment, they were using horses and shovels in their hands and that kind of thing. And then it says in the 1960s, the Borinage basically died. So fairly recently, the Borinage basically just went into decline and basically doesn't exist anymore. So in this Wikipedia page, it also talks about the Dutch painter Vincent van Gogh in his mid-20s spending several years in the Borinage from 1878 to 1880. So not quite in its heyday, but quite close to it. Vincent was in this bleak industrial complex, and he was trying to, do his thing, his idea of what his thing was. He preached to and lived among the coal miners, and eventually had a breakdown. So he kind of went into this environment, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. He'd been reading up about the Bible, reading up about Greek mythology. I told you guys this previously, that he was kind of heading for disaster, and he had this all of this theoretical knowledge, but no real knowledge. Well, the Borinage was a lot of reality, and probably more than he could stand. And so when he got to the Borinage, he eventually actually had a breakdown, right? He went from being totally naive to being totally overwhelmed by the gritty reality of life. And the fact that he insisted on living the way that he did also led to this breakdown. That's how hard he pushed himself, and that's how intense he was. And then following the breakdown, he decided to become an artist. He was like, okay, I can't do this. And so that led to him painting about 6 years later. So even though he was like, okay, I'm going to do art, it took him something like 6 years, almost the same time it would have taken to become a pastor, if it's about 7 years, to eventually paint his first masterpiece, which is the Potato Eaters. It was all about Dutch peasants. It wasn't painted in the Borinage, but it was apparently inspired by the bad conditions of the miners. So I want to show you this picture. It was the first painting that Van Gogh sort of got, sort of achieved, that was sort of worth talking about. And you can see everything is bleak, right? So I'll put a link to that in the description. Okay, have a look at that. What's quite interesting is, so Vincent van Gogh obviously left the Borinage around about 1880, but then another painter followed, not necessarily in his footsteps, but effectively in his footsteps, about 6 years later. And it was a Dutch-born Belgian painter called Henry Layton. And he lived in the Borinage also not for very long, about a year or two. And he witnessed what was known as the Great Strike. So it was where the workers rebelled against the horrible conditions that they were under, the sort of iron fist of the sort of developing corporate monster that was sort of developing, this merciless corporate monster where, you get told what to do, what work to do, and they don't, they brook no truck with, any sort of complaints or anything, just do what we say kind of thing. And then Henry Layton painted a triptych called The Strike, and he worked on that for, I don't know how long, was it 6 years, but he painted it in 1893. That was following this bloody suppression in terms of the Borinage. And the painting is subdivided into the struggle for life after the uprising and another panel called Misery. So even this artist recognized the misery of this area. And so there were a lot of strikes. There was a lot of people that were unhappy with how hard things were. The laborers who were there laboring were kind of every now and then getting very upset with how hard things actually were and wanting a bit of relief. So do you guys want me to read about one of these strikes? It was documented in Misery or Borinage in 1933. Do you guys want me to go into that or go straight to the letters? I just think that this documentary captures some of the essence of what it was like to be there. Robbie Robbins says, did they have unions? I doubt it. I really doubt it. Okay, so Robbie says I should read it. Let me go through it quickly. So obviously this happened 40, 50 years later, but the point to get across here is some of what is happening here is what the laborers would have experienced no matter what the date, right? So this was a documentary dealing with the living conditions of the miners in like a well-known documentary, and was made by two documentarians, specifically about, and I think it was called Misery, Misery or Borinage. So I guess the misery of the Borinage. So this is basically giving you a summation of that. It is one of the most important references in the documentary genre. In 1932, a great strike paralyzed the coal mines of Wallonia, and the response of employers and the police had been merciless. Throughout it all, the broader population was ill-informed and largely indifferent. So meaning the locals, the people who didn't work, they didn't really care about what these laborers were going through. And then it refers to André Thirtyface and Pierre Vermeulen and all the indignant young people involved in the Club de something decided to bear witness to this dire poverty using their weapon, the camera. So there were some people who felt like this is real, unacceptable things are taking place here. And they thought, we're going to bear witness to this. We're going to testify to this basically abuse by using a camera. We're going to take photos of this, and specifically of the dire poverty that they're going through. And so with the aid of a doctor and a lawyer with very little funding, hiding from the police, but supported by the whole population, the shoot took place in difficult and exciting conditions, meaning the shooting this documentary. The film is hard, magnificent. It has lost nothing of its force, its strong emotional impact of indignation and compassion. It has left to the working class the strongest images of its history and struggles: evictions, thin-faced and absent-looking children packed together in slum houses, the procession with the portrait of Karl Marx, the collecting of low-grade coal on the slag heaps at dawn, the begging miner, etc. There's also the shock of images placed side by side, houses standing empty while homeless people sleep in the street, near famine conditions with no aid, whereas big sums of money go to construct a church. Now, that on its own, just that statement at the end, that they're working like crazy and no one cares about them, but then a lot of money gets sort of, directed to build a church. And it's like, wow, that's compassion. These people really need your help. They don't even have a place to sleep, but now you're going to build a church. And it's this ostensible display of goodness and righteousness, when in reality it's callousness and cruelty, right? And so this documentary was really capturing that. But if you're going to say something like, let's say you say, did Vincent van Gogh have a breakdown? Wow, he really has a weak, he really is a weak guy. You know, he's psychologically a very weak person. Nothing could be further from the truth. The people who made this film recognize the desperate circumstances that these people were in, and Van Gogh chose to be in those desperate circumstances. So just this whole idea that he's weak-minded and I don't know what else, weak-spirited, and he's got some disorder. He got caught up in a particular fervor, and he was really inspired by it sincerely, and it was something that he thought was an authentic way of living, and so that's how he lived. And anyone under conditions like this, where you can't eat, you are dirty, things are just utterly difficult and desperate, that's going to be quite a transition to get used to if you've never ever done it before. If you are sort of a middle class chap, it's going to be quite difficult to be constantly dirty, and he probably felt even more isolated where he's now, although he's among these people. I don't know whether they would have felt they can have a proper conversation with him, like about what? What do they talk about? If he says to them, God is counting every hair on your head, do you think that they're going to be like, wow, I feel a lot better now, thanks? So you can kind of imagine some of his good intentions being kind of thrown back at him, right? Subhuman conditions, yeah. Ricardo says, good to see you finding perfection in an imperfect world. Okay. So I think, are you guys ready to get to the first letter? There are not too many letters here, though. Are you guys ready to get back to Van Gogh? So where we ended last time was the letter that he was going to write on the 22nd of July, 1878. But prior to that, his parents had written to Theo throughout the year on the 2nd of March saying, and they were right to be afraid. They kind of said, the concern about Vincent oppresses us heavily. I foresee again a bomb is going to burst. Well, how true? How true are those sentiments, right? How true are those sentiments? They go on to say, it is apparent that the beginning of his studies are disappointing to him and his heart seems to be torn by conflicting forces. It says here, I'm afraid he has no idea what studying means, and now I fear the remedy he will choose will be again a proposal for a change, for instance, to become a catechist, but that doesn't bring in any bread. And that's a pretty sensible response that they've got. They don't know how to deal with their son. They really don't know what to do. They say, we sit and wait, and it is like the calm before the storm. To us, it is a vexation of our souls, and yet you believe in relief that God can accomplish. He creates light in the darkness, but also there's a close relation between human errors and sad results. That's a really great comment there. That's kind of saying, we really hope God is going to take care of the situation. God creates light in the darkness, but then they say, you know what? There's also a close relation between human errors and sad results. Does this happen also under God's guidance? And it is amazing that we experience pain and sorrow when he always goes his way as with a bowed head, while we have done everything we could to lead him to an honorable goal. It is as if he purposefully chooses the way that leads to difficulties. And I don't think there's a truer word spoken about Van Gogh than that. It is as if he purposefully chooses the way that leads to difficulties. That's what it is. On the 2nd of March, you know, he is always a faithful writer. Now we haven't had a letter for a fortnight. You'll remember that Paul was not quite reassured when he had seen him. Paul wrote him about it again, and we received such a strange, conflicting reply. But how unhappy he must be, poor boy. You can well imagine how it worries us. He probably doesn't want anything else but a position with the church, but without study. What a prospect for his living and his honor. Some more letters about, I'm afraid he's very unhappy. It is a sickly existence he has chosen, but he's going to have to endure that, and we together with him. On the 11th of May, I'm not going to read that letter. It's more kind of to Theo. Then the 7th of June, which brings us kind of up to speed. We don't yet know where this crisis will lead to, because I did not want to rush things. I told him that for the time being, he should go on with his lessons for 3 months, giving me time to think it over. In the meantime, okay, so I did deal with that last time. But anyway, the last sentiment is, they say, perhaps we should risk this experiment as a last resort, but everything is still so uncertain. It is a problem that worries us seriously, but let us not lose courage. You have always said, who knows whether he will not pull through someday and succeed. And so he goes through this very dark, midnight of the soul kind of thing. And when he emerges, he's the artist. Not with the skills of an artist, not with the training of the artist, but certainly with the, what's the word? The desire to be an artist. And so that desire is crystallized, is refined, that flame burns blue in the Borinage. That's how he comes to what he wants to do, what he, then there's another letter, 28th July, 1878. He talks about, this is from his father. Vincent spoke perfectly well and made a good impression as far as I know. After all, his staying abroad has not been completely fruitless, nor has the years spent in Amsterdam. When he is called upon, he is able to prove that he has learned and observed a lot in the school of life. However, the cause of evangelization in Belgium cannot boast of a solid monetary base. It is started and continued in faith. But most of the time, if money was necessary, there was no lack of it. So they can't quite understand. They can't quite understand why he doesn't seem to have any money. Then they talk about a guy called Reverend Jones. It was a pleasant coincidence that the Reverend Jones, with whom Vincent had been in England, could accompany us. He had arrived the preceding Saturday and stayed till Tuesday, when he went to Brussels with us. He's a nice human being and has made a good impression upon us all. In Brussels, he spoke well of Vincent, and his presence caused the discussion to be held mostly in English. This gave Vincent the opportunity to show us that he could speak it quickly and correctly, for which they gave him a compliment. We now wait for further instructions about when and how he will start work. Now it's August 1878. Vincent will depart for Brussels on the 24th of August. And this is a letter from Reverend Van Gogh to Theo. May everything go well with Vincent, but oh Theo, it isn't clear yet. He is more absent-minded than ever, probably also because he really concentrates on his thoughts, on his sermons, of which he is making a whole stock. On Saturday he will go, and so will Liz, and then it'll be very quiet here. And now this couple of months later, none of these are letters from Vincent, these are from his family members. Reverend Van Gogh to Theo, Vincent's father, to his brother, 24th of November, 1878. I am on the point of going to Brussels. Mr. Plugger wrote me about Vincent. He is weak and thin. It seems he was not given any prospects, and I am worried. According to Mr. Plugger's letter, he cannot sleep and seems to be in a nervous condition. Therefore, I want to go and see for myself what we should do. So it's quite a bad prognosis. He's weak and thin. He's not eating. He's lost weight. is in a nervous condition, is probably suffering from anxiety. Tomorrow is the end of the 3-month period. So remember, they kind of said you can preach here for 3 months and then we'll decide whether to renew your contract. So they say, tomorrow is the end of the 3-month period. We are almost sure he will not be accepted. We don't talk about it to anybody. Don't do that either. We say to the people who know that Father will go on a journey. We say to the people who know that Father will go on a journey, that Vincent is ill. You can well imagine what a sad journey. Mr. Plugge asked us to come and take him home. What is going to become of all this? So Mr. Plugge seems to be the dude who's in charge, who's kind of his supervisor, his boss or whatever. And he's kind of saying, can you come and pick up your son? Can you just take him home? Can you get him out of here? Now we go into the 5th of December. So it's obviously, I guess, following that journey. Dear Sir, having received a letter from my son Vincent, who wrote that he has addressed himself to you to ask for some work, and who said to you, Sir, wish to have some more information about him from me, his father, I hasten to comply with your request by telling you that it is really my son who, having been looking for a place as evangelist in Belgium for 3 months now, came to see you in the hope that you might give him some light, giving him the advice and information which he needs. May God grant him to find with you the possibility of gaining his bread by practical work of an of an honest kind. Well, I don't know how much longer my voice is going to handle this. So he actually says that really is my son. It's almost like this guy is saying, I can't, hi Stephanie, good to see you here. It's almost like he's saying, no, that really is my son. That weirdo, that actually is my son. Can you please take care of him? Because it's like his colleagues or his counterparts can't believe that this bedraggled, thin, miserable weirdo is from kind of a respectable family. It's just like, what's going on here, right? So now we go into the next letter. Bear in mind, as I said earlier, there are only 4 letters in 1879 and only 6 letters in 1880. And just the fact that there's so few letters, I think, are indicative that Van Gogh is suffering, isn't always very healthy, and reality is really overwhelming him, right? So this is a letter to Theo, almost like on the precipice of this nightmare that's going to lead to a breakdown. It's written on the 22nd of July, 1878. Dear Theo, I add a little word to Father's letter. I was glad to hear that you're getting on well in the foreign country and that you enjoy your life. How I should like to walk with you there some time. Before I read the rest of this letter, do you remember the letter that I read right at the beginning? So it's a letter around about 2 years later. There's no color in the letter. There's nothing where it sort of talks about, I walked past a pond and some geese flew up and the sky was sort of gray and I saw the reflection of a church and a lark flew by and it was just really, really beautiful. There's just nothing there. And all of that stuff's gone. There's no quoting anybody. It's just this very gritty story about failure and disappointment, and it's just really a very practical letter, but it's totally different to the touchy-feely, not wishy-washy, but sort of fictional, theoretical, academic kind of letters that he was writing before, right? And so this is one of the very last letters he writes within that frame of mind, where we're still in that theoretical place, right? I'm just trying to show you just to what extent his feet weren't on the ground, to what extent he wasn't living in the real world, that he was living in this kind of this theoretical fairy tale. And the Borinage was like the nightmare of reality, the desert of the real, right? Which wakes him up. It wakes him up into aspects of the human condition, unfiltered, raw. So it goes on to say, the impression of that journey was satisfactory in that we think I shall find my work there sometime. The course certainly is shorter and less expensive than in Holland. We saw the Flemish training school. It is a 3-year course, while, as you know, in Holland, the study would last for 6 years more at the least. So at this point, he's still talking about studying to become a pastor for another 3 to 6 years. And of course, he's going to come out of this, I'm done, no more studying for me. He says, and they do not even require that you quite finish the course before you can apply for a place as an evangelist. What is wanted is the talent to give popular and attractive lectures to people, more short and interesting than long and learned. So they require less knowledge of ancient language and less theological study, although everything one knows is an asset. But they value more highly fitness for practical work and the faith that comes from the heart. Still, there are many obstacles to overcome. First, one does not acquire at once, but only by long practice, the ability to speak to the people with seriousness and feeling. Fluency and ease. What one says must have meaning and purpose and some persuasiveness to rouse one's listeners so that they will try to root their convictions in truth. In short, one must be a popular orator to succeed there. Now think about how all of this eventually translates into him becoming an artist. You must have the ability to speak to the people with seriousness and feeling, fluency and ease. Well, an artist needs the same thing in terms of his art. One must have meaning and purpose and persuasiveness to rouse one's listeners. Same thing with an artist. There must be purpose to the paint, purpose to the colors, purpose to whatever surrounds it, that's going to rouse the viewer, the person who's looking at the artwork. And didn't he succeed in that? Didn't he succeed in rousing the art world into his expressionism, into his vision? Then he says, messieurs in Brussels wanted me to come for 3 months to become better acquainted, but that would again cause too much expense, and this must be avoided as much as possible. Therefore, I'm staying in Etten for the present, doing some preparatory work, and from here I can occasionally visit both Reverend Mr. Peterson in Mechelen and Reverend Mr. de Jong in Brussels. By the way, my great-grandfather's name is de Jong, so I don't think it's quite spelt the same, but it's quite interesting. Anyway, he says, how long this will take depends entirely on what they will say over there. Father and I have just written them again. Now I will try to write as well as I can some compositions which will prove useful to me later. I'm writing one now in Rembrandt's picture, The House of the Carpenter in the Louvre. The Louvre. Yesterday, Father had to preach in Zundert, and I went with him. The aunts send you their love. I was also at the house of Jan Doorman, who suffers much from rheumatism in his leg and complains that he cannot even walk to Breda anymore. But when he is walking in the fields or the garden, it does not trouble him so much, except the pain forces him to get up very early in the morning. Old age is accompanied by many ailments. Then he talks quite a lot about beautiful, excellent wood engravings. I'm not going to go through all that. Then he says something about it has been a remarkable feature in art and will continue to have a great influence on many people, and it will always have an attraction for those who have a keen sense of high art, just as, for instance, a portrait by Fabritas does. How long is this letter? Okay, it's almost done. He says, that evening when we drove back from Zundert across the heath, Father and I got out and walked a while. The sun was setting red behind the pine trees, and the evening sky was reflected in the pools. The heath and the yellow and white and grey sand were so full of harmony and sentiment. See, there are moments in life when everything within us too is full of peace and sentiment, and our whole life seems to be a path through the heath, but it is not always so. Then he says, this morning I went with Cord. I think this is his younger brother, and there are very, very few references to his younger brother. This is one of the few. And he says, this morning I went with Cord, who is on vacation, to the heath and the pine wood way beyond the mill. We gathered heather for his rabbits, who seemed to be very fond of it, and also enough to fill a flower basket. We sat for some time in the pine wood, and together we drew a little map of Etten. And then he just sort of says, give my kind regards to certain people, and now we go on to the next letter. So we go from the 22nd of July to early August, 1878. If you want to follow with me, it's at this link. Robbie is not seeing colors again. This is before he kind of goes into the Borinage. This is 1878. So we kind of moved back in time. Okay, just to be clear, so now he goes into the Borinage sort of in 1878, 1879, 1880, right? So that's where we are. We're at the early phase of that. Dear Theo, I enclose a note in Father's letter. I too am eager to hear from you again. I certainly hope that you are getting on as well as possible in Paris, and that you see and hear many interesting things. I just received a postcard from the Reverend Mr. Peterson about the middle of August. I shall have to go to Brussels. Brussels, of course, is in Belgium, right? So he's saying, quite soon I'm going to have to go to Brussels. He says, but as no date has been fixed, and as Father and Mother think it is better for me to stay until Anna's wedding, I shall wait until all that is over and then start for Brussels. I'm going to not really read all of that. He talks about writing about a parable of the mustard seed that is 27 pages long. Anyway, then he says, of course, I'm very curious to know how it will be in Brussels. I hope the work may prove successful and be blessed. The fields here are so beautiful now. They are reaping the wheat, and the potatoes are getting ripe and their leaves beginning to wither, and the buckwheat is full of beautiful white blossoms. He also says, adieu, have a good time, and if you can, tell me something about the painters whenever you hear something interesting about one of them. But best of all, I shall enjoy hearing any of your own impressions. Now we go from August to the 15th of August, which is presumably when he sort of leaves. Etten, 15 August 1878. Dear Theo, I enclose a little word in Father's letter to say good morning to you. It is raining outside, as it has been doing often lately, and it is stormy too. I wrote to the Reverend Mr. de Jong, could also be de Jonge, that I am ready to go at once to Brussels wherever work or duty calls. But if there's no urgent reason for my coming immediately, I should like to stay a week longer here because of Anna's wedding, and then arrive on Sunday, 25th of August. I wonder if the exhibition of pictures there will still be open then. I should like very much to see it. So even though he's on the cusp of this nightmare, he's still thinking about art. He's still thinking about pictures. He says, I'm eager to hear from you. I hope to write you more as soon as I'm in Brussels. Also about the exhibition, at least if it isn't already closed. Quite a short letter. And now now big jump to the 15th of November, 1878. So September goes by, October goes by, and now November. The 15th of November, 1878, and it's accompanied by this sketch, if you want to have a look at it. Hey, Jealousy says, when he began painting, he used peasants and farmers as models, and then flowers, landscapes, and himself because he was too poor to pay his subjects. Well said. Yeah, Bridget, you're right. 27 pages on the mustard seed. Okay, how long is this letter? That's quite a long one. I guess you've got quite a lot of news. Letter from Vincent van Gogh to Theo from Laken, 15 November 1878. I know there's a Laken in Switzerland. I'm not quite sure where this Laken is. Let me just confirm. I don't know whether he says so in the letter. Laken is in Belgium. Laken is in Belgium, not quite sure where. But anyway, it's in Belgium. It's actually a suburb of Brussels. So it's actually written from Brussels. Dear Theo, on the evening of the day we spent together, which passed only too quickly for me, I want to write to you again. So bear in mind, his close relationship with his brother is also going to kind of be lost in the murk that is to follow. He says, it was a great joy for me to see you again and to talk to you, and it is a blessing that such a day that passes in a moment and such a joy that is of so short duration stays in our memory and will never be forgotten. When we had taken leave, I walked back, not along the shortest way, but along the towpath. Here are workshops of all kinds that look picturesque, especially in the evenings with the lights. And to us who are also laborers and workmen, each in his own sphere and in the work to which he is called, they speak in their own way. If only listen to them, for they say, work while it is day, the night cometh when no man can work. So you're already getting this blue collar feeling through his letters that his life is starting to change. He's starting to see his environment as an environment of labor, right? Of being grinded down, of dust and boots and blisters. He says, it was just the moment when the street cleaners came home with their carts with the old white horses. A long row of these carts were standing at the so-called Ferme de Boers, I'm not quite sure how to say that, at the beginning of the towpath. Some of these old white horses resemble a certain old aquatinted engraving, which you perhaps know, an engraving that has no great art value, it is true, but which struck me and made a deep impression upon me. I mean the last from that series of prints called The Life of a Horse. I do think is touching on Emile Zola's famous narrative about this horse that spends its whole life in the coal mines, never ever sees the light of day. It talks about, it represents an old white horse, lean and emaciated and tired to death by a long life of heavy labor, of too much and too hard work. The poor animal is standing on a spot utterly lonely and desolate, a plain scantily covered with withered dry grass, and here and there a gnarled old tree broken and bent by the storm. On the ground lies a skull, and at a distance in the background a bleached skeleton of a horse, lying near a hut where lives a man who skins horses. Over the whole is a stormy sky. It is a cold, bleak day, gloomy and dark weather. There's something about his description here that feels like a battleground. It feels like a landscape that is scarred by war, when in fact it's actually just scarred by the greed of people. It's scarred by men that have been reduced to ants, that are ripping the carpets off the landscapes, tearing down trees, turning streams into sort of, what's the word, toxic sludge, right? Just transforming this green landscape into a sort of barren dirtscape, a place where there's nothing alive. And when you see a horse in that landscape, it's like, wow, what's this thing doing? And all the suffering of the people is sort of captured in this animal. Anyway, he says, it is a sad and very melancholy scene which must strike everyone who knows and feels that we also have to pass one day through the valley of the shadow of death. He talks about, he says, the end of human life is tears or white hairs. What lies beyond this is a great mystery that only God knows, but he has revealed absolutely through his word that there's a resurrection of the dead. So you can see he's very much fascinated and caught up by almost death and dystopia, suffering and struggle. He seems to see that that is a necessary spiritual battleground that he's got to join. You know, that is where he's been called to be, to live, to exist. He says, the poor horse, the old faithful servant, is standing there patiently and meekly, yet bravely and unflinchingly, like the old God who said, La garde meurt mais ne seren pas. Anyway, as badly as that was said, the guard dies, G-U-A-R-D, but never surrenders. It awaits its last hour. Involuntarily, I was reminded of that engraving when I saw tonight those horses of the ash carts. So that whole story is kind of a background that he sketches, obviously in words, a sort of a narrative sketch to him seeing like a whole line of horses with sort of ash carts behind them. And he's kind of visualizing this kind of apocalyptic working conditions, I guess, right? But it's still in a way theoretical. He's imagining it through seeing something that he sees in reality, is imagining it through something else. But you can kind of get a sense here of where this is going, right? Then he says, as to the drivers, this is the drivers of these ash carts, he says, with their filthy, dirty clothes, they seem sunk and rooted still deeper in poverty than that long row or rather group of paupers. And so while you might be looking at this with a sense of feeling somber and whatever, he's actually looking at it with excitement, like, yes, I want to go there. I want to do this. I want to be this, right? He says, it always strikes me, and it is very peculiar, that when we see the image of indescribable and unutterable desolation, of loneliness, of poverty and misery, the end of all things, or the extreme, then rises in our mind the thought of God. So it's almost like where some people go and climb Mount Everest to feel like they're alive, where some people climb Mount Everest to be a hero or to feel a sense of heroism. Van Gogh thinks his Everest is the Borinage. I want to go and suffer and struggle and kind of be a hero. I want to kind of be a divine figure, a kind of a savior, messianic figure in this harshness, right? It's his kind of idea of Mount Everest, and the bleaker and more miserable it is, the better. That's how he sees it. He wants to suffer. He wants to be challenged. So he says, at least this is the case with me. And does not Father also say, there is no place where I like better to speak than in a churchyard? For there we are all on equal ground. Not only that, there we always realize it. I think what he quite likes about this poverty is no one's going to be better than him. No one's going to be looking down their nose at him. He's going to be kind of on an equal playing field. But what he doesn't realize is it's everyone is crushed down. It's not like you're just walking around and there's no, everyone is crushed down, and someone or something is crushing you down. The owners of the mine, the bosses, the bosses of the certain labor units, right? Anyway, he says, I'm glad that we had time to see the museum together, and especially the work of Gogh and Leys and so many other interesting pictures, talking about art again, like the landscape of Koosmans, for instance. I'm very pleased with the 2 prints you gave me, but you ought to have accepted from me that small etching, the 3 mils. Now you have paid it all yourself and not allowed me to pay half as I wished to do. But you must keep it for your collection, for it is remarkable, even though the reproduction is not very good. Then he talks about, he encloses a hasty sketch. He says, I should like to begin making rough sketches from some of the many things that I meet on my way, but as it would probably keep me from my real work, it is better not to begin. So it's kind of saying, I'm seeing a lot of things around me that I'd like to sketch, but it's going to keep me from doing the work that I need to do. So I'll probably not even start off with that. And obviously, as the months go by, he's going to change his mind on this particular position. He says, as soon as I came home, I began a sermon about the barren fig tree. So he gets home from this, well, I don't know if he's in this tedious thing yet, but the first thing he does is he composes a sermon. He talks about, the reason I made it is that one sees here so many people that work in the coal mines, and they are rather a characteristic kind of people. This little house stands not far from the road. It is a small inn attached to the big coal shed, and the workmen come there to eat their bread and drink their glass of beer during the lunch hour. When I was in England, I applied for a position as evangelist among the miners in the coal mines, but they turned me down, stating that I had to be at least 25 years old. You know how one of the roots or foundations, not only of the gospel, but of the whole Bible is light that rises in the darkness, or from darkness to light. Well, who will need this most? Who will be open to it? Experience has taught that those who walk in the darkness in the center of the earth, like the miners in the black coal mines, for instance, are very much impressed by the words of the gospel and believe it too. Now there is in the south of Belgium, in Hanau, or is it Eno? Could be Eno. In the neighborhoods of Mons, up to the French frontiers, even far across it, a district called the Borinage that has a special population of laborers who work in the numerous coal mines. In a little handbook of geography, I found the following about them. The Borins, that's inhabitants of the Borinage, situated west of Mons, find their work exclusively in the coal mines. These mines are an imposing sight, 300 meters underground, into which daily descend groups of working men, worthy of our respect and our sympathies. The miner is a special Borinage type for whom daylight does not exist, and except on Sunday, he never sees the sunshine. It's quite an extraordinary statement that for this person, they never see the sun except on a Sunday. He works laboriously by a lamp whose light is pale and dim in a narrow tunnel, his body bent double, and sometimes he's obliged to crawl along. He works to extract from the bowels of the earth that mineral substance of which we know the great utility. He works in the midst of thousands of ever-recurring dangers, but the Belgian miner has a happy disposition. He is used to that kind of life, and when he descends the shaft, carrying on his hat a little lamp that is destined to guide him in the darkness, he trusts himself to God, who sees his labor and who protects him, his wife and his children. So the Borinage is situated south of Les Sines, where one finds the stone quarries. I should very much like to go there as an evangelist. The 3 months trial demanded of me by the Reverend de Jong and Reverend Peterson is almost over. St. Paul was 3 years in Arabia before he began to preach, and before he started on his great missionary journeys and his real work among the heathen. If I could work quietly for about 3 years in such a district, so that's his plan, I want to try and work quietly in the Borinage, always learning and observing. Then I should not come back from there without having something to say that was really worth hearing. So that's really his definition of success. I want to go to this place of great austerity. I want to go to the darkness. I want to go to the valley of the shadow of evil, basically. The valley of the shadow, and I want to have some kind of profound experience. I want to come back with some kind of insight into the world. And I think the insight that he comes back with is the importance of light, and then that eventually becomes the importance of color. He says, I say so in all humility and yet with confidence. If God wills and if he spares my life, I would be ready about my 30th year, starting out with a peculiar training and experience, being able to master my work better and riper for it than now. I write you this again, although we have spoken about it many a time. There are already in the Borinage many little Protestant communities and certainly schools also. I wish I could get a position there as evangelist in the way we spoke about, preaching the gospel to the poor. That means those who need it most and for whom it is so well suited. And then during the week, devoting myself to teaching. You have certainly visited St. Giles. I too made a trip there in the direction of the Ancienne Barrière. Where the road to Mont Saint-Jean begins, there is another hill, the Alsenberg. To the right is the cemetery of St. Giles, full of cedars and evergreen. From where one has a view over the whole city. How much longer does this letter go on? There's now a huge paragraph. Proceeding further, one arrives at Forest. The neighborhood is very picturesque there. On the slope of the hills are old houses, like those huts in the dunes that Bosboom has sometimes painted. One sees all kinds of field labor performed there, the sowing of corn, the digging of potatoes, the washing of turnips, and everything is picturesque, even the gathering of wood, and it looks much like Montmartre. There are old houses covered with evergreen or vines, and pretty little inns. Among the houses I noticed one was that of a mustard manufacturer. His place was just like a picture by Taste Mans, for instance. Here and there are places where stone is found, so they've cut small quarries through which hollowed out roads pass, with deeply cut wagon ruts, where one sees the little white horses with red tassels and the drivers with blue blouses. Shepherds are to be found there too, and women in black with white caps that remind one of de Gogh. So again, is describing the scenes unfolding in front of him. And that's essentially the kind of person he is. He's like a sponge absorbing, when I say scenes, it's not like movie scenes. It's not dialogue and characters and dramas. It's literally outdoor scenes. It's literally, if you're going to set a movie somewhere, it's that initial setting and nothing more. It's the outside. It's just the scene outside. It talks about there are some places here, thank God, one finds them everywhere, where one feels more at home than anywhere else, where one gets a peculiar, pristine feeling like that of homesickness, in which bitter melancholy plays some part, but yet its stimulation strengthens and cheers the mind and gives us, we do not know how or why, new strength and ardor for our work. The day I walked on past Forest and took a side path leading to a little ivy-grown church, I saw many linden trees there, still more interwoven and more Gothic, so as to say, than those we saw in the park. Then he talks about some other things, paintings by Rembrandt, I guess, and then he says, how rich art is if only one can remember what one has seen. One is never empty of thoughts or truly lonely, never alone. So you kind of get the idea that he is quite lonely at this point. That art gives him a sense of not being alone, that he feels the brush of something, familiarity, something that is soothing, some kind of recognition of his experience through what an artist is realizing on the canvas. Then he says, "Adieu, Theo. I heartily shake hands with you in thought. Have a good time, have success in your work, and meet many good things on your road, such as stay in our memory and enrich us, though apparently we possess little. Your loving brother, Vincent." Then he says, "I kept this letter for a few days. The 15th of November is past, so the 3 months have elapsed. I spoke with Reverend de Jong and Master Bokma. They tell me that I cannot attend the school on the same conditions as they allow to the native Flemish pupils. I can follow the lessons free of charge if necessary, but this is the only privilege. So in order to stay here longer, I ought to have more financial means than I have at my disposal, for they are nil. So I shall perhaps soon try that plan involving the Borinage. Once I'm in the country, I shall not soon go back to a large city. It would not be easy to live without faith in him and the old confidence in him. Without it, one would lose one's courage." And that's that letter. How long do you think it is from this letter to the next one? So 15th November 1878, the next letter is the 20th of December 1878, and it's from Vincent's father to Theo. 20 December 1878. 8 days ago, we received a rather nice letter from Vincent, nice insofar as he seems to have found a good boarding house with farmers for 30 francs a month. The reason that it is not much being that he teaches the children in the evening. He was soon accepted with goodwill by many people, and working with these people seems to give him satisfaction. Furthermore, the Reverend Perron has promised him his cooperation. In the middle of January, there will be another meeting of the committee, of which Mr. Perron is the secretary, and he promised him that he would try to do something for him. In the meantime, he spends his free moments drawing big maps of Palestine, which can be used for talks and communion, and with which he tries to make some money. I received one and ordered him to make 4 more copies, for which I gave him 10 francs each. Bear in mind, at this point, Van Gogh is 25 years old. So now we go from 20th of December to the 26th of December, the day after Christmas, from Vincent to Theo. If you guys want to read with me, then you can follow this link. And it's written from the Borinage. My dear Theo, it is time I wrote to you again to wish you firstly all the best at the start of the new year. May many good things be your lot, and may God's blessing rest on your work in the year on which you are now embarking. I very much long for a letter from you to hear how things are going and how you are, and also if you have seen anything beautiful and remarkable of late. So he emphasizes that. And you can kind of almost imagine that the surroundings he now finds himself in are so bleak, so austere, so dark, so smoky and polluted and broken and bare, that he's saying, can you please just tell me about something beautiful that you've seen, right? He says, as far as I'm concerned, you'll be aware there are no paintings here in the Borinage, that by and large, they do not even know what a painting is. So obviously, I've not seen anything in the way of art since my departure from Brussels. So if you think about this, he probably never thought about this. So when he thought of, I want to go to this mine, he probably thought, well, there'll be art there, without thinking about it. You know, I want to go to this area. Well, I'm sure there'll be pictures and paintings and books and whatnot. Actually, no. This is a blue collar sort of community. You're going to find things very, very different, my friend. So anyway, he says, I haven't seen anything in the way of art since my departure from Brussels, but that does not alter the fact that the country here is very special and very picturesque. Everything speaks, as it were, and is full of character. Lately, during the dark days before Christmas, snow was lying on the ground. Everything reminded one of the medieval paintings by, say, Peasant Bruegel, and by so many others who have known how to depict the singular effect of red and green, black and white so strikingly. So even though he's in the Borinage, he's still thinking like an artist. Even though he's there as a pastor and a preacher, he's seeing his surroundings as an artist would. He says, there are sunken roads here, overgrown with thorn bushes and gnarled old trees with their freakish roots, which resemble perfectly that road on Dürer's etching, Death in the Night. That's night, K-N-I-G-H-T. Thus, a few days ago, the miners returning home in the evening towards dusk in the white snow were a singular sight. So just think about that. Think about he's in this black environment where everything is covered in soot and dark dust and is dirty. And then this snow falls on this environment and everything looks literally black and white. There's the almost sense that the snow is clean and fresh and unsullied. Meanwhile, it is juxtaposed directly by the dirt, right? Anyway, he says, these people are quite black when they emerge into the daylight from the dark mines, looking just like chimney sweeps. So that the people are literally covered in black dust, and you can just sort of see the whites of their eyes. And they, at this time of the year, they come out of the mines and everything is white around them. So they come out and into the sparkling landscape, out of the darkness, out of the blackness. It says their dwellings are usually small and should really be called huts. They lie scattered along the sunken roads in the woods and on the slopes of the hills. Here and there one can see moss-covered roofs, and in the evening a friendly light shines through the small-paned windows. Much as we have coppices and shrubby oaks in Brabant and pollard willows in Holland, as far as I know, a pollard willow is a tree that is, the branches are sort of cut, and so it sort of has very stubby branches, and then after a while fresh branches grow out, if that makes sense. Does that make sense? I'm not 100% sure on that, but that's what I think it is. He also says, so one sees blackthorn hedges around the gardens, fields and meadows here. Lately with the snow, the effect is that of black lettering on white paper, like pages of the gospel. Quite an artistic way of seeing that is using here. It's also quite interesting what a metaphorical and symbolic fellow Van Gogh is. He sees reality around him and yet he renders it in quite a symbolic way. It's quite interesting. In other words, he's seeing this landscape as literally pages of the Bible. He sees the snow as the white of the paper and the people walking through it as the letters of the Bible. Quite an interesting visual there. He says, I've already spoken several times here, both in a fairly large room, especially designed for religious meetings, and also at the meetings they usually hold in the evenings in the workmen's cottages, and which may best be called Bible classes. Among other things, I've spoken on the parable of the mustard seed, the barren fig tree, and the man born blind. On Christmas, of course, on the stable in Bethlehem and peace on earth. If, with God's blessing, I were to get a permanent position here, I should welcome that with all my heart. Everywhere around here, one sees the large chimneys and the tremendous mountains of coal at the entrance to the mines, the so-called charbonnages. You know the large drawing by Bosboom, Chardfontein. It gives a good impression of the countryside in these parts, except that here everything is coal, while to the north of Inu there are stone quarries, and in Chardfontein they have iron. I still keep thinking of the day you came to Brussels and of our visit to the museum. I often wish you were a bit nearer and we could be together more often. Do reply soon. I keep looking at that etching of a young citizen over and over again. This is quite a long letter as well. Wow. The miners' talk is not very easy to make out, but they understand ordinary French well, provided it is spoken quickly and fluently enough, for then it automatically sounds like their patois, which comes out with amazing speed. At a meeting this week, my text was Acts 16, verse 9. And a vision appeared to Paul in the night. There stood a man of Macedonia and prayed him, saying, "Come over into Macedonia and help us." And they listened attentively when I tried to describe what the Macedonian was like, who needed and longed for the comfort of the gospel and for knowledge of the only true God, that we should think of him as a workman with lines of sorrow and suffering and fatigue on his countenance, without pomp or glory. I think some of us would say without pomp or ceremony, but with an immortal soul and needing the food that does not perish, namely God's word, because man liveth not by bread alone, but by all the words that flow from God's mouth. How Jesus Christ is the master who can strengthen and comfort and enlighten one, like the Macedonian, a workman and laborer whose life is hard, because he himself is the great man of sorrows who knows our ills, who has called the son of a carpenter, though he was the Son of God and the great healer of sick souls, who labored for 30 years in a humble carpenter's shop to fulfill God's will. And God wills that an imitation of Christ, man should live and walk humbly on earth, not reaching for the sky, but bowing to humble things, learning from the gospel to be meek and humble of heart. So I think what Van Gogh's trying to do is say to these lowly laborers, you guys are awesome. You know, like what you guys are doing is you guys are like on the front lines of God's divine plan. He's kind of saying, you know, Christ led this really humble life, and the greatest thing that a man can do is do the same. The way you need to live is walk humbly on earth. Don't reach for the sky. Like, it's almost like he's saying, don't reach for the sky, go down into the earth and just like live the most pathetic, miserable life you can. And God is going to really love you and bless you for that. It's like, please, you know, don't reach for the sky. Don't even see the sky. Go down into the earth and like just be surrounded by the gloom of the coal. That's awesome. Well done, guys. Nice work. You've really found a great way to be miserable. Well done. I really commend you for that. It's quite ironic that he would later paint the sky the way that he did paint the sky. Yes, as Stephanie says, the work they're doing is worthwhile. He is trying to lift their spirits. But I'm just saying there's something a little bit silly about it, you know, like don't reach for the sky. And think about Van Gogh's most profound artwork. I mean, his most profound artwork reaches for the sky, doesn't it? It's all about the sky. It's called Starry Night, which is about the sky. I'm just saying it's just definitely quite interesting. Maybe it's a bit unfair to contradict him in that way, but you know, it definitely is quite interesting. He says, bow to humble things, learn from the gospel to be meek and humble of heart. Then he says, yeah, the complete irony. I've already had occasion to visit some of the sick. So one thing he doesn't seem to say here is whether they are receptive to what he's saying. He doesn't say they stood up and applauded me. Maybe if they did, he wouldn't say that anyway. But you wonder when he's going blah, 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 what are they really thinking about this ginger fellow that's actually a Dutchman? He's not from Belgium, he's not from France, and he's actually very culturally advanced. What do they actually think of what he's saying? Does he really feel like one of them? Then he says, I wrote today to the president of the committee of evangelization asking him if my case could be dealt with at the next meeting of the committee. And we know what the ultimate result was of that. Then he says, it is thawing tonight. I can't tell you how picturesque the hilly country looks in the thaw, with the snow melting now that the black fields with the green of the winter wheat can be seen again. For a stranger, the villages here are real rabbit warrens with the countless narrow streets and alleyways of small workers' houses at the foot of the hills as well as on the slopes and on the top. The nearest comparison is a village like Scheveningen, especially the back streets or villages in Brittany as we know them from pictures. But you have traveled through these parts by train on your way to Paris and may have fleeting memories of them. The Protestant churches are small, like the ones at De Hoover, though a little larger, but the place where I spoke was just a large bare room, which could hold 100 people at most. I also attended a religious service in a stable or shed. So everything it is simple and original enough. Write soon if you can find the time and know that you are again and again, indeed constantly, in my thoughts. Wishing once more that God's blessing be yours in the new year, and shaking your hand in my thoughts, believe me always, your loving brother, Vincent. When you write, please address your letters care of M. van der Hagen, Colporteur, Pres de Mons, Borinage, Inu, I think. I've just visited a little old woman in a charcoal burner's home. She's terribly ill, but full of faith and patience. I read a chapter with her and prayed with them all. The people here have something unique and attractive about them, thanks to their simplicity and good nature, not unlike the Brabant people in Zundert and Etten. So now we go from the 26th of December, 1878, to March 1879. So there were only 4 letters written in 1879. And we're going to go through all 4 of them, and that'll then conclude this episode. We'll deal with the 6 letters written in 1880 in the next episode. So 4 letters to go. If you want to follow with me, then we are right over here. Stephanie says, so good to have you here, member and part of our group. That's Ricardo. Good to have you here. Hey Jealousy says, a prolific correspondent. He wrote nearly as many letters as he created paintings. Van Gogh composed nearly 800 letters in his lifetime, mainly to his brother and closest friend Theo. Hey Jealousy says, at the age of 27, he abandoned his unsuccessful careers as an art dealer and a missionary and concentrated on his painting and drawing. So he's kind of got 2 years to basically abandon. At the moment, he's 25 years old. So this letter written on March 1879, he's still 25 years old. He writes the following, and this is also from the Borinage. Dear Theo, I heard from Father and Mother that you paid them a surprise visit recently, just after Father came to visit me. I am very glad Father came. Together we visited the clergyman of the Borinage and walked in the snow and visited a miner's family. We saw the coal being brought up out of the mine. It's a mine called the Three Mounds. Father also attended 2 Bible classes, so we did a great deal in those few days. I think that Father has been impressed with the Borinage and that he will not easily forget it. No one who visits this curious, remarkable, and picturesque region can. Kind of bit of understatement there, or euphemism. Anyway, he goes on to say, it is a long time since I wrote you. If with God's help my work here is a success, you must come to see me someday, perhaps when you have to go to Paris again or when you take a business trip. It's a kind of a way of saying, I'm not going to be writing you letters anymore. If you want to, if what I am doing is going to be successful, you're going to have to, if you want to talk to me, you're going to have to come and see me. The other day I found a list of all the coal veins south of Mons, 155 in all, in the house of an elderly man who's worked in the mines for many years. The country and the inhabitants charm me more every day. One has a home-like feeling here, like on the heath or in the dunes. The people have something simple and good. Those who leave are homesick for their country. On the other hand, homesick foreigners lose their nostalgia for their own country and adapt easily. How are Mauve and Maris? Have you seen many pictures recently? Spring is near and it will bring fresh subject material. What has Israel's been doing this winter? That's another artist. They would find so many things here that would appeal to them. When the cart drawn by the white horse brings an injured man home from the mines, one sees things that remind one of The Castaway by Israel's. Every moment there is something which moves one intensely. You can imagine there are casualties, there are people who are injured, there are people who get sick, coughing, lung disease, people who die of starvation and injury, but also starvation, people who die in poverty. And so it is a bit like a war zone, and he finds a lot of meaning, and he's moved in this environment. It's a meaningful environment to him. He also compares this idea of a white horse carrying an injured miner home to a painting called The Castaway. I'm not sure, wonder if I can actually bring it up. But it's once again Van Gogh talking about this idea of being on a deserted island, like Robinson Crusoe. I just want to see if I can show you this particular image. Can't seem to find it. So here is a painting by Israel's. It's a beach scene, but I don't think it's the one that he's talking about, but have a look. Not quite sure why I can't find the one that I'm looking for. Storm. There's Castaway by Charles Yates. I can't find the one by Israel. Anyway, so it's obviously quite an obscure painting. Anyway. Then he says, write again soon, and when you tell me something about painters, remember that I'm still capable of understanding it, though I've not seen any pictures in a long time. It's quite a weird statement to make. He says, when you tell me something about painters, remember that I'm still capable of understanding, even though I haven't seen it for a long time. He says, I've rented a small house that I would like to make my home, but now it serves only as a workshop or study. Father and I, too, think it preferable that I lodge with Denise. Still, I have some of my things there, including some prints on the wall. I must go out to visit a few of the sick and some others as well. Spring is coming, for the larks are singing, and in the wood the branches and buds are beginning to sprout, especially on the older trees. When Father was here, everything was covered with snow, so that he has seen the curious effect of the black, I think it's chimneys, and the many black chimneys in the snow. There are many places here that remind one of that drawing by Bosboom, Chaudfontaine. Let's see if I can find that one. I think we found it. So this seems to be the one that he's talking about. It does look pretty damn bleak, I must say. So he's saying what he sees reminds him of this. Stephanie says, I wonder what happened to letters sent to Vincent. He seems to be most appreciative of them. I think he was, but I think he, for example, used them as kindling for, to make a fire at home. So that letter was March. Now the next one is April. Dear Theo, it is time that you heard from me again. From home I heard that you had been in Eton for a few days and that you were on a business trip. I certainly hope you had a good journey. I suppose you will be in the dunes some of these days and occasionally in Scheveningen. It is lovely here in spring too. There are spots where one could almost fancy oneself in the dunes because of the hills. So I really don't know whether this guy is like a little bit crazy, but he's sort of saying how lovely it is in spring, and he's just shown a picture of this desolation. I don't know, somehow he sees beauty in the most barren, austere environments. That's the impression I get. He says, not long ago, I made a very interesting expedition spending 6 hours in a mine. It was Marcasse, one of the oldest and most dangerous mines in the neighborhood. So again, he's trying to be as hardcore as he can be. It's like, I spent 6 hours in the oldest and most dangerous mine, which was awesome. He says, it has a bad reputation because many perish in it. In other words, many die. He says, either going down or coming up or through poisoned air, fire damp explosion, water seepage, cave-ins, etc. So that's where I want to go. Where's everyone dying and what's the worst place to go? Okay, I want to go there. Can I spend 6 hours there? Awesome. He says, it is a gloomy spot and at first everything around looks dreary and desolate. So there's at least some kind of acknowledgement that things are not particularly picturesque or beautiful, right? Then he says, most of the miners are thin and pale from fever. They look tired and emaciated, weather-beaten and aged before their time. On the whole, the women are faded and worn. Around the mine are poor miners' huts, a few dead trees, black from smoke, thorn hedges, dung hills, ash dumps, heaps of useless coal, etc. Months could make a wonderful picture of it. So even in the most miserable setting, he's like, wow, this would make a great painting from that artist, right? So no matter how like horrible the setting is, like, wow, this artist would love this. That would be awesome, right? Then he says, I will try to make a little sketch of it presently to give an idea of how it looks. I had a good guide, a man who is obviously into the mine. And then he says, a man who has already worked there for 33 years, kind and patient. He explained everything well and tried to make it clear to me. He says, so together we went down 700 meters and explored the most hidden corners of that underworld. The maintenages or gredens, that's the cells where the miners work, which are situated furthest from the exits, are called hiding places, places where men search. This mine has 5 levels, but the 3 upper ones have been exhausted and abandoned. They are no longer worked because there is no more coal. A picture of the maintenages would be something new and unheard of, or rather never before seen. So I can tell you a little bit about my experience with mining. I was once hired to create, compile, put together a safety booklet for a very big mine in the Free State province in South Africa. It's it was an area with a very, very big gold mine. I think the company that commissioned me was called Harmony, and they wanted me to sort of compile a easy to understand but also comprehensive booklet, so, like a safety booklet. And so I went quite a few times to them. I had to understand all sorts of geographical features and mining, mining apparatus. I do know what a dike and a sill and like how certain rock strata had to be navigated when you were mining, and basically author this sort of mining document, but for consumption by the miners, right? Not like by the supervisor kind of thing. And I remember being paid a huge amount of money for that. It was like, normally as a magazine journalist, you get paid a certain amount. Well, I got paid just one of the biggest, what can one call it, checks that I got in my writing career was for that particular thing. So that was definitely quite interesting. So I'm just saying I had a little bit of experience in this. They also wanted to take us down into the mine to give you a real sense of it. But I mean, I was driving into this mining area. I think I have gone into the museum mine in Kimberley, which is where the world's biggest man-made diamond mine is. There's also an even bigger diamond mine in a place called Jagersfontein. So just a little bit of background into what I know about that. But as far as I know, the deepest mine in the world is in South Africa. It's called the Western Deep Levels Mine. And obviously it's so deep that when you go down that far, it's extremely hot. It's literally a situation of you are getting quite close to the molten mantle that you actually start feeling the inner heat of the Earth's surface, right? Did you guys know that? So I see it's actually been renamed. It's also called the Tautona mine. It's a gold mine in South Africa. It's just under 4 kilometers deep, or 2.4 miles deep, and it's home to the world's deepest mining operations. So that's in South Africa. The irony is that Vincent van Gogh's brother wouldn't really participate in the mining side of things, but indirectly there would be a link in that his brother would come to South Africa and his brother would work on setting up rail infrastructure that would link South Africa's mines to South Africa's harbors in order for South Africa was a colony, in order for the for the colonial powers to benefit from the resources of the colony. That makes sense. So if you're interested, this is where the Western Deep Levels mine is in South Africa, the deepest working mine in the world. This mine is apparently featured in megastructures on the National Geographic Channel. So quite interesting. Yeah, Bridget says Earth's core. Well, it's obviously the outer mantle of the Earth's core, but nevertheless. Okay, so he goes on to say, Imagine a row of cells in a rather narrow, low passage shored up with rough timber. In each of those cells, a miner in a coarse linen suit, filthy and black as a chimney sweep, is busy hewing coal by the pale light of a small lamp. The miner can stand erect in some cells. In others, he lies on the ground. So in other words, in certain cells where he's mining, he's actually got to like lie on the ground. The ceiling is so low, right? So can you imagine the claustrophobia? You not only quite far down in the earth, but where you're working, you've got the whole bulk of the earth sort of right above your head. And the only way to make space is by sort of knocking off little pieces of it. Anyway, he goes on to say, the arrangement is more or less like the cells in a beehive, or like a dark, gloomy passage in an underground prison, or like a row of small weaving looms, or rather more like a row of baking ovens such as the peasants have, or like the partitions in a crypt. The tunnels themselves are like the big chimneys of the Brabant farms. So he actually compares the mine to like a massive underground prison, right? Except you're not just sitting there, you've got to work, and the air is dirty, and you are dirty, and your fingers are cut, and it's unpleasant. The water leaks through in some of these cells, and the light of the miner's lamps makes a curious effect, reflected as in a stalactite cave. So although it's black inside some of these tunnels, the walls might be like coal black. You've got the light sort of shining on this blackness. So you can almost imagine, and there's also water, you can almost imagine that it's like the scales of a snake, that something is black, but when you shine something on it, it almost looks like it's wet, right? He says some of the miners work in the maintenages, others, in other words, the maintenance tunnels, others load the cut coal into small carts that run on rails like a streetcar. This is mostly done by children, boys as well as girls. So can you imagine that, these little children going into the very deepest part of the mine because they're smaller, right? Boys and girls. There's also a stable yard down there, 700 meters underground, with about 7 old horses, which pull a great many of those carts to the so-called accrochage, the place from which they are pulled up to the surface. So there's actually a stable inside this coal mine, and old horses sort of live in the stable. And I guess these horses pretty much never come up into the air. You know, they live underground, right? And they say other miners repair the old galleries to prevent their collapse, or make new galleries in the coal vein. As the mariners ashore are homesick for the sea, notwithstanding all the dangers and hardships which threaten them, so the miner would rather be under the ground than above it. I think that's quite an incredible thing to say. You know, like fishermen get kind of homesick for being out there in the adventure of the sea. They say miners feel like they'd rather be under the ground than above it. I think what that's really driving at is a miner who is under the ground is earning money. A miner who is mining is going to get paid. A miner who is active is going to be earning a salary, right? And so, and miners are often so poor. I just mean in his milieu, but also generally, miners are often so poor that if they're not working, their situation is far more desperate. So they're desperate to work, and they're desperate to work in desperate conditions. He goes on to say, the villages here look desolate and dead and forsaken. Life goes on underground instead of above. One might live here for years and never know the real state of things unless one went down in the mines. So all of this is pretty profound stuff, isn't it? People here are very ignorant and untaught. So this is the other side. So he's this very educated, cultured fellow, but also quite a hardcore guy in terms of what he wants to experience. And he says, well, the people here are pretty ignorant, they're untaught, most of them cannot even read. But at the same time, they are intelligent and quick at their difficult work. They're brave and frank. They are short but square-shouldered, with melancholy, deep-set eyes. They are skillful at many things and work terribly hard. They have a nervous temperament. He says, I don't mean by that they're weak, but that they are sensitive. He says they have an innate, deep-rooted hatred and a strong mistrust of anyone who's domineering. That's really quite fascinating. That these miners have an innate, deep-rooted hatred and a strong mistrust of anyone who's domineering. Anyone who's controlling and telling them what to do, they don't like. They want to be shepherded in a somewhat gentle way. He says, with miners, one must have a miner's character and temperament and no pretentious pride or mastery. In other words, call it like it is, be authentic, be real, don't exaggerate and don't minimize. Be serious and be simple and be, tell it like it is, be realistic. He says, one will never get along with them or gain their confidence if you're pretentious. He says, did I tell you at the time about the miner who was so badly hurt by a fire damp explosion? Thank God he has recovered and is going out again and is beginning to walk some distance just for exercise. His hands are still weak and it'll be some time before he can use them for his work, but he is out of danger. Since that time, there have been many cases of typhoid and malignant fever, of what they call lassoot fever, which gives them bad dreams like nightmares and makes them delirious. So despite the torture, the really torturous conditions that they're living under, they've also got to deal with illness, with people getting sick. And obviously in 1880, if you get sick, in that time, you can easily die. So the fact that they're risking their lives, it's no small risk. Even if they work without getting injured, there's the risk that they can work and become ill, right? They can develop a cough. They can develop a fever. They can develop things like really bad things like typhoid, right? He says, so again, there are many sickly and bedridden people, emaciated, weak, and miserable. And in this bleak landscape of sickness and death that Vincent wants to be, he says, in one house they are all ill with fever and have little or no help, so that the patients have to nurse the patients. So that's the other thing. When somebody does get sick, they don't really get any help. There's not a doctor. There are no nurses. The sick have got to take care of the sick, right? Hear the sick, tend the sick, said a woman. The poor man is the poor man's friend. Have you seen, and then he changes and he says, have you seen any beautiful pictures lately? I'm eager for a letter from you. Has Israel's done much lately, and Maris and Mauve? A few days ago, a colt was born here in the stable, a pretty little animal that soon stood firm on his legs. The miners keep many goats here, and there are kids in every house. I think when he means kids, by kids he means small goats, not children. Rabbits are also very common here in the miners' houses. I must go out to visit some patients, so I must finish. When you have time, let me have a word from you soon as a sign of life. My compliments to the Roos family and to Mauve when you meet him. Many good wishes, and believe me always with a handshake in thought, your loving brother Vincent. Then there's a postscript to this. He says, baby goats. Robbie Robinson says, how many men work down the mine? The children work down the mine. Yeah, like little boys and little girls would be at the far end of the mine, loading up the sort of small, almost like a small train. It's like a small carriage that runs on its own little railway track. Bridget says, I understand them not liking controlling people either. I notice in Australia anyway, country folk are much more honest and straightforward, but kinder than those in the city. generally anyway. Okay. So anyway, his postscript reads, going down into a mine is a very unpleasant sensation. One goes in a kind of basket or cage, like a bucket in a well, but in a well from 500 to 700 meters deep, so that when looking upward from the bottom, the daylight is about the size of a star in the sky. Now, can you imagine that? Can you imagine going so far down into the ground that when you want to look out for, where is the exit? The exit is so small that it's like a star in this black sky. It's the only star, right? It feels like being on a ship at sea for the first time, but it is worse. Fortunately, it does not last long. The miners get used to it, yet they keep an unconquerable feeling of horror and fear, which reasonably and justifiably stays with them. So he says the miners kind of get used to this feeling, but even though they get used to it, it's a feeling of unconquerable horror and fear. Bear in mind, when you're in a mine, the chance of the ceiling falling on you is constant. The chance of a wall that you're walking on collapsing, or indeed the floor collapsing underneath you, is constant. Bear in mind that the whole point of a mine is reducing solid earth to tunnels and passages and holes and crevices, making them bigger and bigger and making more holes and crevices. And so the chance is eventually something's got to go, something's got to give. Also, as you extend these corridors and crevices, you necessarily will sometimes do that with explosives. Sometimes the explosives don't explode properly, or sometimes they don't explode whatever they're exploding properly, and these things then collapse later on. And all of that is waiting for you in the dark, right? Another thing that can be a real problem in a coal mine is if you're going down there with a lamp and the lamp is being lit by a flame, well, you're going to have parts of that mine that actually catch fire. And that is a very real problem. You can have coal dust explode. So if there's enough coal dust in the air, it ignites, and that in itself becomes an explosion. You can also have coal burning underground, and then you can't really put that out. And then there's the smoke from that coal as well. That's an ever-present risk as well. Stephanie says, I feel sick thinking about it. I don't even like elevators. Yeah. Bridget says, a better description is more down to earth people, so to speak, the only star. People are so adaptable, but unconquerable horror and fear. I couldn't handle that anxiety. Yeah, so you can think how these people really need kind of a hug. They really need they need a way to soothe their anxiety. And yeah, Stephanie says the inverse of Everest, both dangerous and harrowing. With Everest, the threat is this big sky that has no air. Well, with a mine, you have this sort of the walls themselves that are heavy and black and that can crush you. You can be crushed by the sky or the invisible air that is around you. Yeah, so it is. If you wanted horror and struggle, well, Vincent, you found it. He says, but once down, the worst is over, and one is richly rewarded for the trouble by what one sees. And then he says, my address is Vincent van Gogh, care of Jean-Baptiste Denis, Rue Petit Wasmes, Borinage, Inu. And that's that letter. Quite a long letter from April 1879. Then the next letter is June 1879, and this is preceded by a couple of letters from his parents to Theo. I think I will read these letters in the next episode. There are a couple of letters, but it just gives a different perspective on what he's going through. So I'll read that next time. Let's deal with the last two letters. One from August 1879, and another also from August 1879, and then that's it. He doesn't write any more letters for the rest of the year. The following letter would be almost a year later in July 1880, so you must know. And that letter that he writes a year later is the one that I read to you guys right at the beginning, where he says, I'm writing to you rather reluctantly, because you sent me 50 francs. So the next two letters bridge the remaining gap to that letter. Okay, so here we go. Two letters, then we're done. This is quite a short letter. Letter from Vincent van Gogh to Theo, 5th August 1879. Dear Theo, I write to you in a great hurry. Won't it soon be time for you to go to Paris? If so, write me the day and the hour, and in all probability I shall see you at the station. I don't know if that's very likely. Anyway, it says, if you have time to stay a day or more or less, I should be very happy. I should have some drawings to show you, so he's already been drawing. Types from here. It wouldn't be worthwhile for you to leave the train for those alone, but you would easily find something to attract you in the scenery and in the curious. So he's kind of saying to his brother, come and visit me, come here. You're going to find their scenery interesting. He says, everything in this neighborhood is such a picturesque character. Now he talks about books. He says, have you read Hard Times by Dickens? Well, isn't that the most appropriate title? But that is what is infecting his mind. He says, I've written the title in French because there exists a very good French translation in the Hachette edition. So I think what he's saying is that he's translated Hard Times by Charles Dickens into French. Anyway, he says, it is a masterpiece. The author in this work has painted a moving and sympathetic portrait of a working man called Stephen Blackpool. So if you want to get a real sense of what is really inspiring Van Gogh, what is the spirit that is, we're not skipping June. Those are letters from, did I miss June? Oh, sorry about that. 1879. Letters from his parents. Okay, 1879. So it looks like there's another letter as well. Okay. Well, so it's going to be quite a long. I was really hoping this was almost over. Okay, June 1879. Dear Theo, it is relatively late, almost 12 o'clock, but I want to write to you before the day is over. In the first place, it is so long since I wrote you, but my dear fellow, what shall I write? I'm up to my ears in work here, so that the days pass without my having time to think of or keep up an interest in many things that used to attract me. So he says, I don't have really time to think or even be interested in the things that I used to be interested in. What prompts me to write, thanks, Stephanie, thanks for alerting me to that. We don't actually want to miss a letter, so thanks for that. What prompts me to write is that I heard from home that you have an offer to go to Paris for 6 weeks. If you go there, you will pass the Borinage. Oh, so that's why he invites him, because he knows he's on his way. He says, I wanted you to consider spending a day or more if possible here. I should so much like to have you know this country too, because it has so many peculiarities for one who knows how to look at things attentively. To one who had never seen a village by the sea, would it not be interesting to see Scheveningen or Katwijk or any other such village? Well, there's no sea here, but the character of everything is interesting and worthy of notice. So if you feel inclined and have an opportunity, stay here. but do write beforehand when you're coming and where, at which station I shall find you and on what train. As far as I know, Theo doesn't go and visit him there. I could be wrong. As far as I know, he doesn't take him up on his invitation. I shall give this letter to mother when she comes, for in all probability I shall meet her when she comes back from Paris. So apparently Vincent's mother had been called to Paris because their uncle had fallen very ill, and they say dangerously ill. So they've got a family member who's sick at this time. He says, I'm looking forward to seeing her, meaning his mother. Happily for uncle, the danger seems past for the present. So there's this constant background of illness and sickness and death with other people. He says, the news of Franz Sook's death touched me deeply. If you know any particulars, I should like to hear them. Poor fellow, his life was not easy, for he had many struggles. A few days ago, we had a very heavy thunderstorm at about 11 o'clock in the evening. Quite near our house, there is a spot from which one can see far below a large part of the Borinage, with the chimneys, the mounds of coal, and the little miners' cottages, the scurrying little black figures by day, like ants in a nest, and further on, dark pine woods with little white cottages silhouetted against them, a few church spires away off, an old mill, etc. Generally, there's a kind of haze hanging over it all, or a fantastic chiaroscuro effect formed by the shadows of the clouds, reminding one of pictures by Rembrandt or Michel or Ruysdael. But during that thunderstorm, in the pitch dark night, the flashes of lightning made a curious effect. Now and then everything became visible for a moment. Nearby the large, gloomy buildings of the Marcassus mine stood alone, isolated in the open field, that night conjuring up the huge bulk of Noah's Ark, as it must have looked in the terrible pouring rain and the darkness of the flood, illuminated by a flash of lightning. Tonight, in a Bible class, I described a shipwreck still under the influence of that thunderstorm. So he sees tremendous symbolism in these spectacles of nature, and you can see what a visual fellow he is. He's really caught up by the visual spectacle. He says, I often read in Uncle Tom's Cabin these days, there is still so much slavery in the world. And in this remarkably wonderful book, that important question is treated with so much wisdom, so much love, and such zeal and interest in the true welfare of the poor oppressed that one comes back to it again and again, always finding something new. Wow, this is quite a long letter. I still can find no better definition of the word art than this. Art is man added to nature. Great definition, isn't it? Art is man added to nature. In other words, nature is it's a primary part of man's creativity. Man is derived from the creativity that is nature. Nature brings out the inherent creativity of men. Theo has disappointed Vincent, not visiting a few times. Yeah. Okay, so he says, art is man added to nature. Nature, reality, truth, but with a significance, a conception, a character, which the artist brings out in it and to which he gives expression, which he disentangles, sets free, and interprets. A picture by Mauve or Mans or Israel says more, and it says more clearly than nature herself. So it's quite interesting where he says art communicates what nature can't about nature. Someone says art is an imitation of nature. It is the same with books, and in Uncle Tom's Cabin especially, the artist has put things in a new light. In this book, though it is becoming an old book already that is written years ago, all things have become new. The sentiment in it is so fine, so elaborate, so masterly. It is written with so much love, so much seriousness, so faithfully. It is humble and simple, but at the same time, so truly sublime, so noble and refined. So this is really a letter you don't want to miss. It's a letter you don't want to skip, right? It's got some really good moments in it. He says, recently I read a book about the English coal district, but it did not give many particulars. Enclosed is a wood engraving for your collection. The other day I made so this is a little story he tells. Thanks, Bridget. Thanks a lot. The other day I made the acquaintance of somebody who has been a foreman over the miners for many years. Of humble origin, he is a self-made man. He has a lung disease, so at the end of this whole period, if you've survived, if you've worked and you've overcome your fear to some extent, if you've dealt with this unconquerable horror, what do you have? What is the reward at the end of it? Well, maybe a little bit of treasure, but maybe also like a lung disease. Thanks, Bridget. I have. Thanks, Bridget. Thanks a lot. Stephanie says, it feels like visiting here with friends in our Van Gogh group. Well, I'm glad that it feels that way. It definitely is like sitting around the fireside when we deal with this. Although I'm in winter, so I would think that way. Maybe it feels like sitting around having a picnic for you guys. Anyway, so he talks about this self-made man. He says, now he has a lung disease serious enough and can no longer stand the terribly fatiguing work down in the mine. So he actually can't work in the mine anymore. It is very interesting to hear him speak about all those things relating to the mines. He has always remained a friend of the miner, unlike so many others who have always got on, but more for the sake of money than real distinction, and prompted by less noble and very often mean motives. He has the heart of a laborer, faithful and honest and brave, but he is far superior to most of them in intellectual development. More than once during a strike, so remember we spoke about the strikes in the documentary. Well, it really is definitely part of the fabric. The laborers protesting, the laborers saying, this is pushing us too far, this is too dangerous. Can you imagine being in the mine and there's a thunderstorm and all that water's got to go somewhere, and there are these black holes in the ground and you in a black hole in the ground? He says, more than once during a strike, he has been the only person with any influence on the miners. They would listen to nobody. They would follow nobody's advice but his. And he alone was obeyed in the critical moment. You can kind of imagine Van Gogh probably wishing and hoping that he could have that kind of influence, that he could soothe their fears, that they would listen to him, right? So he says, he alone was obeyed in the critical moment. When I met him for the first time, I thought of the etching by Messonnier. So even here, like he's describing this guy and he sees him as a portrait. He says he thinks of the etching called The Reader. One of the Denise boys is about to become engaged to this guy's daughter. That is why he visits the house here now and then, and though rarely. And so I made his acquaintance. Since then, I visited him a few times. Have you ever read blah, blah, blah? It is a remarkable book. I found it at his house and read it with interest. Then the final paragraph of this letter. A few days ago, I received a letter from the Reverend Mr. Jones of Isleworth, in which he writes about building little wooden churches here in the Borinage. Is that practical? Is it desirable? He is ready to work for that end, and that is for the erection of the first of such little buildings. He even speaks of coming here in the autumn to talk it over. I certainly hope it happens. If you have time, write me a line, and if you can, stop here when you go to Paris. At all events, let me know, if possible, on what train you will be passing. So he really wants his brother to come visit him. And maybe when his brother doesn't visit him, he takes that as quite a slight, quite a disappointment. Okay, so that's that letter, and then now we're on to the 5th of August. I'm not going to reread what I read, but he basically says again, aren't you going to Paris soon? You're still coming. And then he talks about Charles Dickens' Hard Times, and the character in it that is so moving, a portrait of a working man called Stephen Blackpool. He says, I was in Brussels recently and in Maria Hurbeca and in Tournai, partly on foot. For the present, I am at the following address, M. Frank Evangelist at Kismis near Mons. Okay. Evangelist, okay. There have been many thunderstorms here lately. Do try, dear fellow, and arrange to stay over an hour or so. He's saying, basically begging his brother to visit him. He says, lately I've been at a studio again, namely at the Reverend Peterson's, who paints in the manner of Schelfhout or Huppenbrovers and has a good ideas about art. He asked me for some of my sketches, a minor type. Often I draw far into the night to keep some souvenir and to strengthen the thoughts raised involuntarily by the aspect of things here. So he's saying that he's been drawing quite a lot late at night to remember things that he sees, to strengthen the thoughts that he has. He says, but boy, I have no more time. I've written to Mr. Tiersteg to thank him for the box of paints he sent me. So, wow, that's the first reference to asking for a box of paints. He was also asked for a sketchbook, which he says is almost half full. Now, you know what's quite interesting is shortly after asking for the paints and the sketchbook, him and his brother break contact. And I think it's a combination of he feels that his brother lets him down, but also that he's able to occupy himself with sketching and painting. He doesn't so much need the letter writing. He's able to, I guess, soothe himself and occupy himself through drawing, sketching, painting. He says, in Brussels, I bought from a Jewish book dealer another big sketchbook of old Dutch paper. Will I see you? How welcome you would be. I promise you Dickens's Hard Times if you'll come and fetch it. Otherwise, I will send it to you when I have a chance. Ricardo says, unfortunately, art needs to be sold. That's why anonymous work is more valuable to the public. Okay, and I think this brings us to the last letter from Vincent to, and at this point he's living in that house, that nice house that you've seen, right? That I sent to you. Do you guys know what I'm talking about? It's anyway, it's the one that I posted right at the beginning. You guys know which house I'm talking about? It's also the house that appears on the title image to this video. Anyway, so he says the following. This is really his last letter to Theo before he says, I'm writing to you reluctantly. And that's like a year later. So this is quite a substantial break in their relationship in terms of length, in terms of he's not in a really great place, and then his brother, in his mind, abandons him, right? Letter from Vincent to Theo, mid-August 1879. Dear Theo, I'm writing to you especially to tell you how grateful oh, so he did visit. Oh, okay. Okay, well, I didn't know that. There goes my theory. Okay, I'm writing to you especially to tell you how grateful I am for your visit. So even though his brother visits him, he doesn't write to him for another year after that. It had been quite a long time since we had seen each other or had written as we used to. Still, it is better to be close than dead to each other, the more so as until one is truly entitled to be called dead by virtue of one's legal demise, it smacks of hypocrisy or at least childishness to carry on as if it were true. Timmy, do you wanna sit by me? Is it cold? he says, or at least childishness to carry on as if it were true. Childish in the manner of a young man of 14 who believes his dignity and rank in society oblige him to wear a top hat. The hours we spent together have at least assured us that we are both still in the land of the living. When I saw you again and walked with you, I had a feeling I used to have more often than I do now, namely that life is something good and precious, which one should value. And I felt more cheerful. Timmy wants to like lie down on my keyboard. Oh, shame, he's quite tired. Are you quite tired? Are you sleepy? Are you cold? I think he is definitely quite tired. Okay. When I saw you again and walked with you, I had a feeling I used to have more often than I do now, namely that life is something good and precious. So you can see he's quite disillusioned by reality, quite disappointed by what he's experiencing, quite disappointed probably by his fellow man in a way. Perhaps not so much the miners, the laborers, but their bosses. He says, I felt more cheerful and alive than I've been feeling for a long time. Because in spite of myself, my life has gradually become less precious, much less important, and more a matter of indifference to me, or so it seemed. So it seems like he's saying here, my life's not very important. I'm kind of indifferent to what I need, and that's making me feel cheerful and alive. So you kind of get the sense that if you're a Buddhist, that Van Gogh's ego is fizzling into nothing, and he's suddenly feeling quite happy in a spiritual sense. Then he says, when one lives with others and is bound by feelings of affection, then one realizes that one has a reason for living, that one may not be utterly worthless and expendable, but is perhaps good for something, since we need one another and are journeying together as companions on a voyage. But our proper sense of self-esteem is also highly dependent on our relationship with others. So you sort of wonder whether, Stephanie says, theories evolve as we learn more, right? Yeah, definitely. There's a good example of that. But one thing that I think happens when Vincent sees his brother is there's a bit of a status shift where his brother is somewhat well-to-do. His brother's got a proper job. His brother would be obviously sort of probably shaved and washed and cleaned and quite civil in the sense that he's come from the city, and now he's rubbing shoulders with his brother who's probably dressed in a certain way. And although Van Gogh has wanted that, it's probably been a little bit of a shock to see, well, my younger brother is there and I'm here. And maybe in a way he feels like running away even more, if that is what he's doing, that he wants to run away from society and society's measurements, where they measure status. I actually had a conversation with my brother the other day, and something struck me that I'd sort of forgotten about. And what I mean is, we were talking about sport. I think we were watching cycling. We were talking about sport. And I told him something that I probably hadn't told him before, which is I'd taken part in an event. I'd taken the whole year off just to train for this event. I had the goal of being the number one swimmer in my state, and I really worked for it. And then I achieved it. I did win in this particular event, but by the thinnest of margins. And the lesson I learned wasn't, the lesson certainly in terms of swimming was I could just as easily have lost. I put in so much effort, I put in so much sacrifice that I could just as easily have lost because it was so close. At the same time, the lesson was also, if you set your mind to something, if you decide to do something, you can do it, right? You can be the master of your own fate. Because I shared that, he seemed to also share that he said, I didn't achieve the same as you did. And he said part of what got him to just stop swimming completely was I reached a point where I was as good as my brother who was 2 years older, or maybe even better, but I started getting state colors in swimming, whereas I don't know if he did. And then I think he felt embarrassed or something like that. Do you know what I mean? He felt that since I was the younger brother and I don't know what you want to call it, surpassed him in the swimming sense, he felt he'd lost face. Right? I didn't really see it that way. I said, what? You were better than me. You were faster than me. You were older than me. So I was trying to get as fast as you. I was trying to. I was modeling my swimming on yours. I was trying to reach par with you. You know what I mean? But I can understand from his perspective, because I was younger, that feels like losing face. And so he didn't really want to swim anymore. I didn't actually realize that he didn't get free state colors in swimming. I think he did get it in biathlon though. But what I'm trying to say is Vincent van Gogh may have felt something similar, where his younger brother is still the success and he's not really. And then I'm just trying to think, why would he not write to his brother for a year? It could have been just nothing personal, that his circumstances just overtook him. But it could also be that the last time that he did see his brother, he felt like he'd lost face. Here he is, this hard scrabble fellow, and maybe he felt like my brother doesn't really respect me very much. I'm not saying that his brother didn't respect him, but he may have imagined that was the case, if that makes sense. It does seem interesting that he talks about one realizes that one has a reason for living, that one may not be utterly worthless and expendable. And he maybe even Theo had said words to that effect, but being brought on from their parents, that dad and mom are worried that you are this and that and the next thing. And maybe in a weird way, Vincent liked the fact that they were worrying about him. He's getting some kind of attention. But anyway, so he talks about, it's like, if you think about it, these people in the mines, are they not utterly worthless and expendable? And he's saying no, but it's also like he's going to these mines maybe because he feels worthless and expendable, in terms of how he's lost his work and he's not been hired and whatever. And so now he's among people that feels the same way about life maybe that he does. Anyway, he says perhaps these people are good for something. And didn't Van Gogh turn out to be very good for something? A very good artist, a very important commentator on a particular time in art history and in the human. And that's why, to me, it's just such a great injustice that you then say, well, he killed himself. When you're such a strong way, naive, in some ways irrational, but definitely not crazy, not mad, not suicidal. He purposely put himself into such hardship that no wonder he was able to survive the asylum when he'd gone through this. he'd been through much bleaker environments than this, definitely. So we're coming up to the last couple of paragraphs. So he talks about a prisoner who's condemned to solitude, who's prevented from working, will in the long run, especially if the run is too long, suffer from the effects as surely as one who has gone hungry too long. Like everyone else, I need friendly or affectionate relationships or intimate companionship. And what do you think he means by intimate companionship? And am not made of stone or iron like a pump or a lamppost. And like any man of culture or decency, I cannot do without these things and do not feel a void, a lack of something. And I tell you this to let you know how much good your visit has done me. So I must say, one wonders, did the miners sometimes like go to brothels in search of relief from the tedium and the torture of their daily lives? And did that lead to Van Gogh doing the same thing? I've been asking all along, at what point did Van Gogh start going to brothels? Anyway, he says, and just as I would not want us to become estranged. Now, it's really interesting that he says these words and then doesn't write to him for the next year, right? So it kind of makes you feel like something didn't go completely well during this visit. I mean, something had to have happened that led to him, after so many years, not writing to his brother for almost a full year, right? So he says, and just as I would not want us to become estranged, so I would want to keep in with all at home. For the moment, however, I'm not very keen on going back there and would much rather stay on here. Yet it may well all have been my own fault, and you could be right about my not seeing things straight. And so you get the idea that his brother arrived and said, dude, you're crazy. What are you doing here? Why are you wasting your life, right? And his brother's saying to him, you're not seeing straight. And wasn't he right, ultimately? I mean, he got out of the Borinage and he didn't become a pastor, right? And so Vincent doesn't like being told what to do, and he doesn't like being told you're wrong. And he ultimately, although he says, I don't want us to become estranged, they do for like a year, which is why when he writes back to him, he says, I do so reluctantly. I'm writing to you reluctantly. He says, and so despite my great reluctance, and though it is a hard course for me to take, I may yet go to Eton at least for a few days. As I think back with gratitude to your visit, my thoughts return to our discussions as well, of course. I have had similar ones before, even a good many and often. Plans for improvement and change and generating energy, and yet do not be offended. I am a little frightened by them, not least because I've sometimes acted upon them only to have my hopes dashed. How fresh my memory of that time in Amsterdam is. You were there yourself, so you know how things were planned and discussed, argued and considered, talked over with wisdom. Can you hear someone snoring? Can you hear that? Argued, so I'm definitely ASMRing this little doggy. Anyway, talked over with wisdom with the best intentions, and yet how miserable the result was, how ridiculous the whole undertaking, how utterly foolish. I still shudder when I think of it. Someone says, I may have to re-watch. We are experiencing a bad storm, and Nick's audio is going in and out. Re-watch. Anyone else having a problem with audio? Robbie says, did they say intimacy in those days also to mean close platonic relationships? I doubt it. Okay, yeah, Jimmy ASMR. Okay, well, I hope your audio works out, Amy. Good luck with that storm. So then he says, I still shudder when I think of it. Now, it seems like he's shuddering when he thinks of Amsterdam. It was the worst time I've ever lived through. How desirable and attractive have become the difficult days, full of care here in this poor country, in these uncivilized surroundings compared to that. So it's quite difficult to wrap your head around what he's saying. Is he's saying that when he was in Amsterdam, it was the worst time that he's ever lived through. So all the times of study, study, study. And he says the uncivilized surroundings that he's in now is much, much better. And of course, he's about to have a breakdown. So that's the difficult, Van Gogh is navigating a very confined space in his own psychology. I can't be successful. I don't want money, but I want to be at least fulfilled. I want meaning in my life. That's sort of how he measures what he wants. So he doesn't want success, he doesn't want money, but he does want to feel fulfilled. He doesn't want to feel like he's in the right place. And the right place seems to be a place that's hard and bleak. Then he says, I fear a similar result if I follow wise advice given with the best intentions. This is obviously a bit of a, not a snipe, but a bit of a comment, response, reaction to Theo. When Theo was there, he was obviously surprised. He was obviously worried. And so he says, I don't know if I want to follow wise advice, meaning your wise advice with the best intentions. He's saying, I could end up in the worst, going through the worst time I've ever lived through. I think what he's talking about is studying to be a pastor he found horrible. Studying the Bible and learning Latin and Greek. Like I say, I tried to learn Latin and it actually caused me to abandon my pure law studies. That was one of the main reasons, Latin. I came back to law when I changed degrees, but then it wasn't obviously my major, but nevertheless. Anyway, he goes on to say, such experiences are too dreadful. The harm, the sorrow, the affliction is too great not to try on both sides to become wiser by this dearly bought experience. So he's saying, I want to learn to become a preacher through experiencing it, by being a practical preacher. I don't want to sit at home studying, And so at least he feels a little bit more alive in these derelict surroundings, right? He says, if we do not learn from this, what shall we learn from? To try to reach the goal which was set before me, as the expression was then. Indeed, I no longer aspire to it. The ambition is greatly abated. Even if it looked and sounded well before, now I look at those things from another point of view, gained by experience, although this opinion is not permissible. Sure, I'm not going to read the next paragraph, but he says, I've sometimes had a lesson from a German mower that was of more use to me than one in Greek. A change for the better in my life, shouldn't I long for that? Or are there times when one has no need of betterment? I hope I do become much improved, but precisely because that is what I long for, I'm afraid of cures worse than the disease, right? So although his family are saying, don't do this or whatever, he feels like he doesn't have any alternative. He says, can you blame a patient for standing up to his doctor and preferring not to be given the wrong treatment or quack remedies? So he's really standing up, and it seems like he's standing up to his brother. He says, is it wrong for someone suffering from consumption or typhus to insist that a more potent remedy than barley water might be indicated, might indeed be essential, or while finding nothing wrong with barley water as such, to question its effectiveness and potency in his particular case? In a way, he's arguing with his brother. He's kind of fighting with his brother. He says, the doctor who prescribed the barley water would be wrong to say, this patient is an obstinate mule who is courting his own destruction, because he refuses to take his medicine. No, it is not that the man is unwilling, but that the so-called remedy is worthless, because though it might well be good for something, it does not fit the case. I sometimes wonder whether if Vincent just was in love with someone, if he just had a girlfriend, if that wouldn't settle a lot of the feelings he has to find meaning and to find whatever. And I think the fact that he was rejected in his love in England was the beginning of this downward journey, right? As Stephanie says, he is trying to be authentic, but with very little experience of reality, even though he's just started. Like, he's trying to be authentic. I guess he is being authentic, but he still has only just touched the surface of the Borinage. He's only just gotten to know the surface of it. And if he really wants to experience it, he needs to not write to his brother, and he needs to, if he really wants this experience he needs to forego everything. And he's about to do that. He's about to have that. And hence they're only going to be, I think, 6 letters in the next year, and most of them at the end of the year. He says, if you should conclude from these remarks that I meant to suggest your advice was worthy of a quack. In other words, he's saying, if you're going to say that what I'm writing, I'm saying you're a quack, then you have completely misunderstood me. And I must say, I was starting to think that he's saying that. He says, as I have no such thoughts or opinions about you. If, on the other hand, you believe that I would do well to follow your advice literally, to become an engraver of invoice headings and visiting cards, or a bookkeeper or a carpenter's apprentice, or follow the advice of my very dear sister Anna to devote myself to the baker's trade or many other similar things, curiously at odds and hardly compatible, that other people advise me. So yeah, he's talking about all the things that people are telling him to do. Someone saying you should be a carpenter's apprentice. Someone else says you should be a bookkeeper. Someone else says you should be a baker. Someone else says you should be an engraver. You should write down invoices. And he's saying, I don't want any of that. And I must say, I went through a long period of, what do they call it, like the midnight of the soul or something, where I was trying to find my calling. And I was prepared to go on oil rigs in the North Sea. I went all the way to Aberdeen to do that, and so on. And he eventually gave himself permission to do what was quite obvious, which was he loved art, and then he became an artist. I kind of did the same thing. I eventually gave myself permission to do what I was very interested in doing and liked doing, which is writing. But it took quite a long time just to give myself that permission. I went on this very roundabout route where I studied to become a builder, to become a lawyer, to become a businessman, to become an economist, to become a journalist or whatever, and eventually gave myself permission. And so he needs to go into this very scary world in order to say, wow, I survived that. What could be more scary than that? Well, how about becoming an artist? And it was. Becoming an artist was scary, but it couldn't touch the Borinage, the bleakness, the destitution of the Borinage. So someone said here, sad that being prolific outweighs being a health nut. Okay, so let's finish up here. He says, so he's obviously, they did have a bit of a conversation, and you get the feeling he felt a bit insulted by what his brother said, and perhaps what he said in return his brother was a bit hurt by, because his brother meant well. But it's like, I want to help you, but I don't know how to. And Van Gogh's like, you can't tell me what to do, kind of thing. then he says, and now all joking aside, hang on, what did he say about a donkey? He says, um, at the same time, it would be a foolish answer, more or less like the action of a man who, when reproached with cruelty for riding a donkey, immediately dismounted and continued his way with the donkey on his shoulders. Right? So he's kind of saying to his brother, it's like, you telling me that, why am I riding a donkey? Okay, I'll get off the donkey and put the donkey on my shoulders and keep going. Right? He says, all joking aside, it is my honest opinion that it would be better if the relationship between us were to become closer on both sides. If ever I came to believe seriously that I was being a nuisance or a burden to you or those at home or of no use to anyone, and were obliged to look upon myself as an intruder, or to feel superfluous so far as you are concerned, so that it would be better if I were not there at all, and if I should have to try all the time to keep out of other people's way, were I really to think that, then I should be overwhelmed by a feeling of sadness, and I should have to wrestle with despair. I find it hard to bear this thought, and even harder to bear the thought that so much dissension, misery, and sorrow between us and in our home may have been caused by me. Should that indeed be the case, then I might wish it were granted me not to have much longer to live. This is, in a way, very close to him saying, if things between us had to go sour, then I might take my own life. He's not quite saying that, but it seems like he's saying, if something pulls us apart, I would be overwhelmed by a feeling of sadness. I would wrestle with despair, and I would not want to live much longer. But he doesn't actually say I would take my own life or I'd kill myself. He says, I wish it would be granted to me to have not much longer to live. In other words, that I would maybe get sick, that I would trip over my feet into the sort of jaws of a lion kind of thing, right? Anyway, he says, yet when this thought sometimes depresses me beyond measure, far too deeply, then after a long time another occurs too. Perhaps it is only an awful, frightening dream, and later we may learn to see and understand it more clearly. I think that is, in a way, quite true, that he is in an awful, frightening dream at this point, and he will learn to see and understand more clearly as the dream progresses, and maybe nightmare. And he says, or is it real, and will it ever get better rather than worse? So you can see, in a way, Vincent's the author of his own terrible circumstances, but somehow is nevertheless in control. You've also got to ask yourself, how on earth do you get a person out of this? How on earth do you rescue someone? How does he rescue himself? And the answer seems to be time. Just let him, let the life experience wash over him, and then he'll learn. He says, it is sometimes so bitterly cold in the winter that one says, the cold is too awful for me to care whether summer is coming or not. The harm outdoes the good. But with or without our approval, the severe weather does come to an end eventually. And one fine morning, the wind changes and there is the thaw. So he's being quite portentous here. What he's talking about is going to come to pass. It's quite the portent of this letter is going to be borne out in reality. So I don't know whether it's intuitive, but it certainly is interesting. He says, when I compare the state of the weather to our state of mind and our circumstances, subject to change and fluctuation like the weather, then I still have some hope that things may get better. Just kind of saying the weather changes, and so why wouldn't reality? And I think that is a very good analogy. I remember when I was at school, it was quite well known that I was a good writer, right? So when I was in high school, a lot of people knew that I'm quite good with writing. And so somebody, I think their mother died or somebody close to them died. And so the task fell to me to write something for this person. I didn't know him very well. I don't think he was even in my class. I think he was in another standard, but they selected me to write something to him. And I wrote that, the sun will come out from behind the cloud. The light will return. You are in a place now of gloom and shadow, but the sun will come out. So it's kind of the same thing. He's talking about the weather as an analogy to one's moods, that the weather changes, so do moods, right? Anyway, then he says, if you were to write again soon, you would make me very happy. Should you do, please address your letter to care of J.B. Denise, Rue de Petit, and it's in Inu. Haino. I don't know how to say it. That's why we need Bria here. Anyway, then he says, walk to Wasmus the evening after you left. Have drawn yet another portrait since. Goodbye, accept a handshake in my thoughts and believe me, yours truly, Vincent. So yeah, he doesn't say your, what did he say in the last letter? He said, also yours truly. What did he say in the one before that? Your loving brother, Vincent. So it's gone from your loving brother to yours truly in the last two letters. And so that is it, mid-August, and then the next one is July the next year. So I don't know whether Theo wrote to him in the interim. I think he probably did, and then stopped when Vincent didn't answer him. So even though he asked him to write to him, and I think he did, Vincent didn't reply. And so that's where we're going to pick it up, July 1880 in episode 12. We go from July to August 1880, September 1880, September 1880, October 1880, November 1880, and then that's the end of 1880. And from this point, there are more and more sketches that come about. So we are heading into the beginning period of Vincent van Gogh, the artist. And can you see what a incredibly fraught, bleak, intense, heartbreaking, difficult time immediately precedes that. It's like a baptism of fire, right? At the coalface of life and of death, right? I can't believe that I've gone over 3 hours. I really was actually hoping that this would only be an hour. But I really didn't think that these letters would be like 3 or 4 times the usual length. But there you go. But I think you'll agree with me that they were pretty powerful letters, pretty profound. And can you see how sensible he is, even in the midst of the madness that's kind of taking place? Can you see how sensible he is? I'm talking about that he makes sense, even within the confusing and terrible and difficult circumstances that he's in, right? So Stephanie says, what are your thoughts on the poll? So did Vincent van Gogh's mission to the Borinage bring him closer to God? About 40%, well, it's split pretty even. 40% say yes, or 39. 37% say no, and then it's gone quite a bit up to a quarter of you saying yes and no. If you asked me my opinion before I went into this, I would have said, isn't it yes and no, that he did come closer to God and then he didn't. I don't know. I can't help feeling the answer is no, because you could argue that the evangelist dudes that are in control of his future, them rejecting him is why he rejects them and why he rejects being a pastor. I don't think you can get away from the fact that he could still have become a pastor. He could have been a pastor in his father's church. In other words, he could have, it could have been like, okay, that's a setback. You don't want me to preach in the Borinage. I can't be in this setting. But he could easily have just gone and, lived with his parents, become a pastor there. But that's not what he did. Instead, he goes to the Borinage, and while he's in the Borinage, Stephanie says no, good one. While he's in the Borinage, he sort of realizes that that's not going to be his future at all. So he goes there to become a preacher, and he comes out of there basically ready to become an artist, right? So it doesn't bring him closer to God, it brings him closer to an artist, becoming an artist. If you want to argue that an artist is closer to God and to understanding God and to preaching God's word than a preacher, well then I suppose you could say yes. But I think the right answer to the poll is no. It didn't bring him closer to God. You could maybe say yes and no, that maybe for a while it did, but he wasn't there for terribly long. So, and by the time that I would sort of interpret that to, he wants to become closer to God, and so he wants to become a pastor, but by the end of it, he doesn't even want to become a pastor. And by the time he's had that incident with Gogh Voss, it's like I don't know if he even believes in God. I don't know if that's like a moment of anger, but after Gogh Voss rejects him, it's almost like he's totally done with that aspect. I don't think he becomes an atheist, but I think he becomes somewhat agnostic, because none of this is in his letters when he's in Orvers. And his life does totally change. He becomes this sort of bohemian drinker and womanizer and brothel visitor, to the extent that he gets syphilis and he visits prostitutes. So that's a very big difference to the Vincent of the Borinage and leading up to the Borinage. Does that make sense? Hey, Jealousy says maybe he internally loved God. Maybe. Stephanie says extremely profound. I'm glad you've enjoyed it, Stephanie. Happy birthday to Corporal Deb. Corporal Deb, I think, has joined us fairly late. Robbie Robin has just left us. Good night, Van Gogh friends, and happy Platinum Jubilee weekend. Thanks for that. Corporal Deb says maybe he became a bit disillusioned. Corporal Deb says, I see Timmy's paw. Yeah, it's just over here. Okay, guys, I really can't believe my voice lasted like at the hour mark. It felt like, and I don't have any water, so I'm quite amazed that I managed to get through it, but there you go. I'm really glad Stephanie joined us. In fact, I was actually going to cancel tonight. I was just like not going to do it at all. And then when Stephanie was talking about the verdict in the Johnny Depp case, then I just thought, well, it's not really such a big deal, maybe. And I did have quite a few hours that I needed to get through. So there we go. Stephanie says, thank you for tonight. I can't be here Sunday. My son has a competition, so I'm most grateful. Yeah, I'm really glad you were here, Stephanie, and glad that you got something out of it. And also thank you for getting me onto that onto that June letter, because that was quite an important letter. So you really did you had a very important function here as well. Thanks so much for that $20 as well. Appreciate it. Also want to thank the members here and for your contributions throughout a lot of these other live streams. The reason I'm saying it is May was quite a difficult month for my channel. I actually saw a stat on my stats on my dashboard. I think it said channel growth minus 999%, like almost minus 1,000%. I don't quite know how it does the mathematics, but where we'd normally gain, I don't know, sometimes 5,000 subscribers, sometimes, I don't know, 1,000 subscribers. This time I lost like minus 400-500. I mean, I gained some, lost some, gained some, lost some. But anyway, May was the first really bad month for the channel. I just mean if you want to see it sheerly in terms of numbers and earnings and subscribers. So the first time since the channel came into existence that it really took like a downturn. And yet despite the downturn, a lot of contributions from you guys, from the members, actually meant that my income went up even from the previous month. And a lot of that had to do with you guys. So I just want to thank you guys for that. It's also why I didn't want to let you guys down by not being here. So I really appreciate your support, your interest, and your guys being here. There'll probably be at least 10 more Van Gogh letters, maybe even 20 more, I don't know, but there's still quite a lot to get through. Where we are now is really an interesting part of the story, because from here on out, we kind of going into the artist narrative, and that's really an adventure of its own. So from really the next letter, it's 1880, and it's the last decade of Van Gogh's life. And the last decade of Van Gogh's life is definitely something quite special. The arc of it is really something quite special. We've gone into the darkness. Well, now is the long climb out into the light. Corporal Deb says, you're very welcome. Thanks for that. Stephanie says, that is beautiful. Love this community. Love you all. Most of you. Okay, thanks, guys. Thanks you guys for being here, and hopefully see you guys on Saturday or Sunday. We'll see. We're also going to be hearing from Stephanie dealing with the CrimeCon thing. Is that Friday or Thursday? Or none of those days? Hey, Jealousy says, when do we submit our paintings and drawings? Let me think about that. Not there yet says, good luck on your son's competition. I think it's a robot thing. Robotics. Saturday. Okay, Saturday. Okay, so CrimeCon third one will be Saturday with Stephanie, so don't miss that. Margaret Zabinski says, thanks for the live stream. And I think that is it. 3 hours, 23 minutes. Timmy's sleeping. I think I'm going to have a hot bath, and I've got some supper that is somewhat warm, just needs a little bit more warming up. Take care, stay safe, and I'll see you guys next time. All the best.